Chapter 197. The long night was coming to an end. When the darkness dissipated and the bright morning light shone through the window, Li Tianlan, who had been in the same position all night, finally moved his body. It seemed that he hadn't moved for a long time. As he moved, the sound of his joints vibrating came from his body. In the clear sound, he began to concentrate completely. His eyes were a little sore because he stayed up all night. He turned off the lamp in front of him, shook his head hard and looked out of the window. The pale golden morning light shone through the window. The soft light shone into the bedroom. The sky was high and the clouds were light. The sun was rising. Outside the French window, the trees and flowers were all bathing in the long-lost sunshine on such an early morning. Li Tianlan slightly narrowed his swollen eyes and came to the window. He looked at the sunshine outside the window with no expression. The rainstorm that swept through the whole East Island had stopped. Outside the window, there were crystal drops of water hanging on the treetops, shining with a subtle and soft light in the sunshine. The first day of the 7-day period passed quietly in the bright and rare sunshine. Wind, rain and sunshine. The natural environment was alternating. But the depression in Li Tianlan's heart never decreased. Meditation had almost replaced his sleep. He was busiest when he had nothing to do. The unique techniques of Zhuanyuantai tribulation, and even the Wang family of Beihai were running in his mind all the time. Li Tianlan had never had this kind of mentality before. This kind of desire, even the crazy mentality of wanting to become stronger. The mentality of survival and becoming stronger had been messed up. Li Tianlan couldn't be sure whether he wanted to become stronger because he wanted to survive or to survive because he wanted to be stronger. He didn't bother to think about it. There was not much conflict between the two. He was still alive, so he would try his best to become stronger. That was all. The morning sun rose slowly in the cool morning wind. The light covered the earth and shone on every corner. Li Tianlan didn't move, letting the sun cover him. In the morning light, his whole body seemed to be emitting a pale golden brilliance. In the blurry light and shadow, there was a calm and determined face. Dongqing Rushi had already sat up from the bed. She blinked her sleepy eyes and stared at Li Tianlan's back. She didn't leave last night, nor did she do anything intimate with Li Tianlan. When Li Tianlan was studying unique skills, she slept on Li Tianlan's bed. The simplest companionship was also the most silent and gentle. No one could know how perfect Li Tianlan had been instilled in Dongqing Rushi's mind since she was a child. He was everywhere, and as the two of them got closer, the vague impression seemed to become clearer and clearer. Dongqing Rushi's two personalities couldn't be sure if this was love, but even if it had nothing to do with love, playing the role of a fiancé was definitely what she wanted to do most now. She moved her body on the bed, and the confusion in her eyes gradually disappeared. She gradually became clear-headed and cold. Haste makes waste, you've heard of this saying, right? I don't object to you risking your life, but proper rest is still necessary. Otherwise it will only have the opposite effect. She looked at Li Tianlan's back shrouded in light and said in a flat tone. He didn't need to ask which personality of Dongqing Rushi this tone belonged to. Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows slightly and was not surprised. He said calmly, I've already rested. 2 hours of sleep a day? Or nearly 10 hours of meditation. If you think that this so-called rest can help you, then forget about what I said. Dongqing Yueshin's tone was a little cold. Li Tianlan frowned and said nothing. So far he had seen Dongqing Yueshin 3 times. But each time they talked they parted on bad terms. Li Tianlan didn't hate Dongqing Yueshin's personality, but it was hard for him to like her. Generally speaking, she seemed to be born with a bad temper. What on earth are you worried about? Dongqing Yueshin sighed softly, got out of bed and walked to Li Tianlan. Samsara. Li Tianlan didn't hesitate this time. He seemed to have an answer in his heart. In the morning light he took out a cigarette and lit it. He took a deep breath and suddenly said, Does the Dongqing clan have any information about Samsara's action this time? Dongqing Yueshin froze for a moment. Li Tianlan continued, This time Zhongzhou State is plotting against East Island. Samsara is fully cooperating, but it can't be voluntary help, right? What does Samsara want? Do you have any information about this? Dongqing Yueshin thought about it and shook her head. No. You should know that our family can't care about this now. In our family, except for you and me, only my godfather is in Changdao. The others are in Zhongzhou State. The Battle of Changdao is not the focus of our family. Our family. Dongqing Yueshin said this word naturally, almost instinctively. Li Tianlan took a deep look at her and said nothing. Right now, the main focus of the Dongqing clan was not on Changdao. Even Jade Pool didn't make much effort in this nation-toppling plot. When countless forces of Zhongzhou state began to expand outward, someone in the rear had to pay attention to the defense. Dongqing Wudi, the god of massacre of Zhongzhou state, was flying around the camps of the Border Control Corps almost every day. He had no time to care about Changdao and Samsara. Right now, Zhongzhou state wasn't peaceful either. A large number of East Island experts were trapped in Huading, including several experts of the Invincible Realm. The whole of Huading could become the fourth battlefield besides Changdao, North America and Northern Europe at any time. Similarly, the famous Border Control Corps of Zhongzhou state was also an obvious target. The Dark World was a world full of cruelty, blood and violence. But behind a series of negative words, it also meant that this was an absolutely rational world, especially when the superpowers rarely fought against each other. In the current situation, the special warfare system of East Island was in danger, and it was inevitable that Zhongzhou state would benefit. So it was time to pay attention to balance. If East Island was driven to desperation, it might let the experts trapped in Huading break out of the encirclement and turn Huading into a new battlefield. But if there were no great benefits, how could other forces cooperate willingly? They paid attention to balance. Since the rise of the Snowdance Corps was inevitable, it was acceptable to inflict a heavy blow on the Border Control Corps and let the Snowdance Corps grow. The Border Control Corps was famous and all of them were elites. But it was much easier to attack them at the border than to sneak into an away battlefield. Everyone understood this. Now all the eyes of the Dongqing clan and Jade Pool were focused on the defense of Zhongzhou state. To put it bluntly, they didn't care about anything here in Changdao at all. Don't worry. Her Highness of Samsara defeated Gu Xingyun and is in the limelight. Who will have the time to mess with her? She'll be fine. Dongqing Yueshan said slowly. Li Tianlan nodded and then shook his head. He said with gloomy eyes, I'm worried about her after the battle with Gu Xingyun. Dongqing Yueshan didn't know what to say about this. In recent months, the most glamorous person in the whole dark world was undoubtedly the mysterious master of Samsara Palace. She killed Night Spirit, entered Mount Dibing, fought Gu Xingyun and plotted against Zhongzhou state. She was a woman but she had a kind of powerful spirit. Her every move had a kind of unparalleled divine power. But all of this happened too frequently. Li Tianlan wasn't the only one who was worried about the state of the master of Samsara Palace at the moment. Most people were not optimistic about her current state. What do you want to eat? I'll do it. Dongqing Yueshan was silent for a while, then she simply changed the topic and asked. The Dongqing clan had always been very clear about the cultivation of Dongqing Rushi. First of all, she was the fiancée of the Li family and second she was a genius of martial arts. Under this cultivation mode, Dongqing Rushi's cooking skills were needless to say. A breakfast was no problem for Dongqing Rushi's two personalities. No. Li Tianlan shook his head, turned around and said, I don't have an appetite. I'm going out for a walk. Dongqing Yueshan said faintly, Oh, I'll accompany you. I can take a breath of fresh air. You. Li Tianlan looked at Dongqing Yueshan with a strange look. Dongqing Yueshan, whose personality was sharp and almost fierce, snorted coldly and said directly, Do you have a problem with that? Shouldn't you go back? Li Tianlan said euphemistically. It was easier for him to accept the main personality of Dongqing Rushi. She was peaceful, pure, beautiful, and noble without any blemish. I'm not going back. Dongqing Yueshan shook her head, glanced at Li Tianlan and said with a faint smile, If you want to see her, tomorrow. Li Tianlan paused, looked at Dongqing Yueshan thoughtfully and suddenly said, Rushi really doesn't know about your existence? For the time being, yes. Dongqing Yueshan said faintly. But if you accompany me today when she shows up tomorrow, who can explain to her what happened today? Li Tianlan squinted and asked, We only have 7 days. Now is the first day. I have my ways. Dongqing Yueshan said faintly and went straight into the bathroom to wash up. Li Tianlan stood where he was and his eyes became deeper and deeper. Until this moment he vaguely realized that Dongqing Rushi did have a split personality, but the Dongqing Yueshan in front of him was no longer the subpersonality of Dongqing Rushi. She had a dual personality, two completely independent consciousnesses. In this sense, when Dongqing Yueshan appeared, she was Dongqing Yueshan, and Dongqing Rushi was already in a deep sleep. Even if Li Tianlan was not an expert in this field, he knew how rare it was to have two almost independent consciousnesses in one body. But before he decided whether to study it or not, there was a knock on the door. Li Baitian's voice came from outside the door. Tianlan, are you up? Li Tianlan was stunned. He answered and walked over to open the door. Although the people of East Emperor Palace had lived in the same villa for many days, they didn't have much time to see each other. Under the pressure of the general trend, everyone was trying their best to improve their strength. Even if they met each other after meditation, they would be busy with their own things after a few words. Li Tianlan couldn't remember how long he hadn't seen Li Beidian. At this time when he heard his voice he had a strange feeling. Li Beidian, who was dressed in a neat suit, was standing in front of the door and tidying up his clothes. Seeing Li Tianlan come out, he casually said hello, morning. Morning. Li Tianlan nodded. Looking at Li Beidian who was dressed so formally, he smiled unexpectedly and said, dressed like this, are you going on a date? It's stupid to dress like this for a date. Damn it, this shit is suffocating me. Li Beidian pulled the tie on his collar and said with a wry smile, there's a meeting today. I'm here to say hello to you. All the superpowers are going to attend. You should also get ready. I guess someone will come to pick you up soon. He paused, shook his head and said with a slightly complicated tone, I really want to go with you. Now, hey, it's okay. Li Tianlan shook his head with a smile and said, there will always be a chance in the future. Although Li Beidian didn't say it explicitly, Li Tianlan knew what the so-called meeting was. The final battle was about to break out. Zhongzhou State really needed a meeting with enough weight to coordinate all aspects. Now there were nearly 2,000 elites of Zhongzhou State in Changdao, but only a few were qualified to attend this meeting. Those who could step into the meeting were all powerful, influential figures. Li Tianlan's East Emperor Palace had just been established. As a department-level agency, its starting point was definitely not low. But such an agency was a piece of cake in the eyes of the big shots. Institutions of this level, to put it bluntly, were no different from cannon fodder in the Battle of Changdao. The reason why Li Beidian could attend this meeting was not because of East Emperor Palace, but because of Mount Shu. Mount Shu's Great Void Sword Master. This identity was much more important, especially in the current situation. Different from Jade Pool, which focused on defense and Dongqing clan's advance and retreat, Mount Shu was arguably one of the most active transcendental forces in Zhongzhou State's plot. Swords scattered in the southwest. In the past 2 months, the personnel of the special warfare system in the southwest of Zhongzhou State had changed frequently. A considerable part of the leaders of the Special Warfare Agency were replaced by swordsmen from Mount Shu. From the southwest border to the southwest inland, the brilliant sword intent of Mount Shu was shining everywhere. Mount Shu's Phantom Sword Master went to the southwest border. Yin and Yang Sword Master Han Chongyang went to Changdao in person. Mount Shu never lacked resources. Once their thousands of sword intents broke out, in a short time, both their influence and strength were expanding rapidly. Nowadays, Mount Shu had become a force that couldn't be ignored, whether it was the defense of the southwest of Zhongzhou State or the Battle of Changdao. If Yin and Yang Sword Master Han Chongyang didn't come, it would be fine. But with Yin and Yang Sword Master Han Chongyang here, no matter how young Li Beidian, the Great Void Sword Master, was, no one dared to ignore him. Li Beidian would attend the upcoming meeting as the Great Void Sword Master of Mount Shu, and Li Tianlan would probably attend the meeting as the Samsara Palace. As for the East Emperor Palace before it grew up, it was a complete joke in the eyes of the big shots. Change your clothes. Li Beidian shook his head. Today all the big shots of the domestic special warfare system are here. We can't lose. I just got a call. I guess people from Samsara will come to pick you up soon. Li Tianlan nodded. Before he said anything, Dongqing Yueshin, who had finished washing, walked out of the bathroom. She asked casually, where are you going? There's a meeting later. I guess I have to go too. Li Tianlan answered casually as well. There were 2 groups of elites that Zhongzhou State sent to East Island. The first group was relatively simple. Most of them were elites of the Special Warfare System or freshmen of the Special Warfare Academy. But the second group was completely different. There were many extraordinary figures in it. Although the second group was only about 600 people, the weakest one was an elite in the fire-flaming realm. Some transcendental or neutral forces like the Terracotta Army, Mount Shu, Azura Path, Sai City, and Kunlun City also gathered together. This was an extremely powerful force, but it also contained complicated and entangled grievances. It was really hard to say what the meeting would be like. I'll go with you. Dongqing Yueshin said, oh. This was also where she was different from Dongqing Rushi. She was direct and almost domineering. This sentence from her mouth was not so much a discussion as a notification. Li Tianlan nodded subconsciously. His mind was not on this at all. The 2 naturally asked and answered, but Li Beidian, who was beside them, gradually became dull. Dongqing Rushi's fiancé was Li Tianlan. Before this, even Ning Qianqing did not know this news. Now it was no longer a secret, but Li Baidian did not expect that the two would develop so fast. How long had it been? Did the second miss of the Dongqing clan sleep with Tianlan? Fuck, the couple in the name of fiancé and fiancée was really unscrupulous and domineering. Li Baiqian's eyes flickered. He inadvertently caught a glimpse of a faint white at the corner of Dongqing Yueshan's mouth. The white was so small and faint that it could not be seen clearly. But the more he looked at it, the more suspicious he felt. The corner of Li Baiqian's mouth twitched slightly. Looking at Li Tianlan, who still looked calm, he really wanted to beat this bastard to death for indulging in sex so early in the morning. I'll go pick out some clothes for you. After saying this, Dongqing Yueshan wiped the remaining toothpaste foam at the corner of her mouth and turned to leave. Li Baiqian's expression was strange and he was speechless for a moment. What's wrong? Another voice abruptly rang out. Ning Qianqing's figure walked out of the bedroom not far away and looked at Li Baidian. I'm worshipping my idol. Look at my expression, don't I look very pious? Li Baidian looked at Ning Qianqing and said. Ning Qianqing seemed to be in a very bad mood and his face was a little gloomy. He frowned inexplicably and looked puzzled. Look, it's this one. Come and take a look. Li Baidian looked at Li Tianlan with an exaggerated expression. The strongest holy knight of the century has appeared. Brother, aren't you going to worship him? What nonsense are you talking about? Li Tianlan and Ning Qianqing said in unison. Goddess Qin Dongqing Rushi Wang Yuetong. Tieske, who can ride a goddess if not a holy knight? Tianlan, you're good. I felt sorry for you because Goddess Qin appeared by your side, but it turns out that you're the pickiest and want the best of everything. I've seen a dragon knight in Master Jin's martial arts novel, but I didn't expect to become a brother with a holy knight. I'd feel sorry for myself if I didn't worship him. Fuck you. Li Tianlan scolded with a smile and pretended to rush forward to kick him. Li Baidian laughed and disappeared in a flash. I'll go down and have a look. You guys talk. Li Tianlan shook his head helplessly and looked at the silent Ning Qianqing. What's wrong? Why do you look so bad so early in the morning? Nothing serious. Ning Qianqing shook his head and said, there's a meeting in a while. Did Baidian tell you about it? Li Tianlan grunted and then felt something was wrong. He looked up at Ning Qianqing and said, you're going to attend? What's your identity? Li Baidian was the great void sword master of Mount Shu. It was understandable that he would attend the meeting. As for Li Tianlan himself, several super masters of samsara were around him because of his relationship with Qin Weibai. He had to attend as well. As for Ning Qianqing, Li Tianlan really didn't expect him. I'm one of the representatives of the Eastern Theater of Operations. Ning Qianqing said with a gloomy face. The representative of the Eastern Theater of Operations. Li Tianlan was stunned. He looked at Ning Qianqing and didn't say anything for a while. Ning Qianqing's father, Ning Ziyuan, was the commander of the Eastern Theater of Operations in Zhongzhou State. The Eastern Theater of Operations invested so much in the Battle of Changdao that it was incredible. In terms of strength, it was hard to say which force was the most powerful. But in terms of numbers, the Eastern Theater of Operations invested more than any other force in Zhongzhou State. Ning Qianqing became one of the representatives of the Eastern Theater of Operations, which meant that he had become one of the leaders of the Eastern Theater of Operations in the plot against East Island. Have you talked to General Ning? Li Tianlan asked softly. He knew very well about the knot between Ning Qianqing and Ning Ziyuan. He couldn't empathize with the past, but if the father and son could reconcile, it wouldn't be a bad thing anyway. No. Ning Qianqing's gloomy face showed some confusion. It was the marshal who called me. He asked me to go. Dongqing Wudi's order? Li Tianlan's heart skipped a beat and his eyes suddenly became deep. The commander of the Border Praetorian Corps was intentionally or unintentionally interfering in the affairs of the Eastern Theater of Operations. What did this mean? Zhongzhou State East Island inside and out. It seemed that everything was getting more and more complicated. I got it. Li Tianlan was silent for a long time before he nodded and said, let's go downstairs and talk. Ning Qianqing agreed. The two of them went downstairs side by side. For a while no one spoke. Marshal Dongqing, do you have a good relationship with General Ning? Li Tianlan suddenly asked. How good can it be? Just a nodding acquaintance. At least as far as I know, the two of them didn't have any contact before. At most, they just greeted each other at a meeting. Ning Qianqing shook his head gently. That's what I'm most surprised about. The Eastern Theater of Operations sent 2 batches to Changdao, and more than 80% of them were my father's henchmen. After these people left, his control over the Eastern Theater of Operations would decline. It's impossible that he didn't know that the marshal asked me to be the representative of the Eastern Theater of Operations. Now the result is, he didn't continue but started to think. Li Tianlan didn't say anything either. The current situation was really complicated. The struggle in the dark world was complicated, the attitude of East Island was complicated, and the entanglement behind the scenes in Zhongzhou State was also complicated. Li Tianlan had seen some things clearly now. But the more he saw, the more he realized that he couldn't see. When the wind and rain stopped and the sun rose, in front of Li Tianlan's eyes, there was still a mist. After seeing Li Beidian and Ning Chenxing off, Li Tianlan stood alone in the yard, enjoying the sunshine and fresh air that he hadn't seen for a long time. But his mind had already drifted somewhere. The breeze blew softly in the sunshine, bringing with it a gradually burning warmth. A deep voice suddenly rang out and interrupted Li Tianlan's thoughts. "Good morning, young master." Su Chu, who was as tall as a giant, stood in front of Li Tianlan, giving off a sense of oppression and power. "Good morning." Li Tianlan opened his eyes and nodded with a smile. But his eyes instinctively moved to the back of Su Chu. Behind Su Chu, 3 figures in black were standing quietly, not revealing any aura. Under the bright sunshine, there seemed to be darkness spreading around the 3, swallowing everything around them. "Marshal uncle." Li Tianlan froze for a moment, then smiled in surprise. "You're back from Dongdu?" Among the 3 men in black, Tribulation, who stood in the center, nodded and said in a low voice, "Just arrived." Before Li Tianlan could speak, he continued, "Tianlan, change your clothes. There will be a meeting later and you'll attend it with us." Li Tianlan's smile suddenly froze on his face. He knew that he would attend this meeting, but he didn't expect that he would attend it with Sai City instead of Samsara Palace. The news was so sudden that he wasn't mentally prepared at all. "Marshal uncle." His smile slowly faded and he said calmly, "Where are Duke and the others?" Tribulation was silent for a moment, and then he said calmly, "They've left a few hours ago." "They've all left?" "They've all left." Tribulation nodded. "But they'll attend the meeting later, and Sai City will take care of everything you have in East Island from now on." Li Tianlan's mouth moved but he couldn't say anything. At this moment he suddenly thought of Li Beidian, Ning Chenxing and several supermasters of Samsara who had left without saying goodbye. However, those vivid images, including Tribulation, had all become chess pieces in his mind at this time. He himself became a chess piece. The general trend was like a chessboard and everyone was a chess piece. In every slight or serious turbulence of the situation, all the chess pieces were uncontrollably moving closer or farther away. Involuntarily. Faintly, he could clearly sense that some things were approaching him, while others were moving further away from him. It turned out that the farther away. Li Tianlan looked calm. Chapter 198. Everything seemed to be unstoppable. This was Li Tianlan's sudden thought. The wind and rain in the dark world seemed to be changing all the time. Being in the rainstorm, Li Tianlan had a feeling that if Zhongzhou State's plot against East Island at the beginning was just a pure accident, then the layout after the accident was full of artificial traces. At this point, Li Tianlan wasn't sure if the situation was out of Zhongzhou State's control. But in the general trend, he could already see a looming black hand pushing everything forward. The departure of Samsara. All the superpowers entered Changdao. Even the activity of Mount Shu and the Eastern Theater of Operations. And the current currency war. Every step seemed to be under the control of the Black Hand, and it never deviated from the original track. And as time went by, all the current events seemed to be slowly coming to an end. 7 days. When the time passed, what would happen to Zhongzhou State, East Island, and the superpowers in the dark world? Li Tianlan thought silently. At this moment he felt very complicated inside. This kind of view of the general trend from a very high place with very low strength was broad enough, but it didn't feel good. He could clearly feel that something was slowly changing, but he couldn't do anything about it, so he was unwilling to accept it. He stood very high but not the highest because there was still wind and rain above his head, so he was depressed. "If I am invincible," Li Tianlan laughed at himself, looked at Tribulation in front of him and nodded. "I see." At this moment his expression was calm and tough, as if he could suppress everything. But how horrible it would be when all the suppression broke out. He took a deep breath, hid all his emotions and suddenly said, "Who are these two?" The 2 men in black who came with Tribulation were a man and a woman. The woman looked younger, at most 30 years old, with a plump figure and delicate skin. She wore loose black clothes and wore no makeup. She looked a little mysterious and enchanting like a black rose. At first glance she looked weird, but at a closer look she had a kind of charm. The man next to the woman had a beard and a weathered face. He was tall and thin, and his ordinary appearance looked extremely gentle. When they didn't speak, they stood beside Tribulation like two shadows, dark and ethereal, without any sense of existence. But Li Tianlan clearly felt danger from them. That faint, almost non-existent feeling made him instinctively vigilant, and even his body seemed to be subconsciously in a defensive state. Assassin. This was Li Tianlan's first impression. An assassin who did not reveal his aura or even carry killing intent was undoubtedly a top-notch assassin. Before Tribulation could introduce her, the woman standing on his left had already bowed slightly. She was obviously in a low position, but she did it with elegance and arrogance. Her voice was clear and extremely cold, yet it carried a trace of tenderness that made one's heart tremble. I'm Sunset Shadow. The middle-aged man on the right side of Tribulation laughed freely and heroically, with a kind of unique coldness and boldness after being attacked by wind and snow. His voice was not very loud, but it was extremely clear and sounded penetrating. In Li Tianlan's slightly narrowed eyes, Yumu and Sunset Shadow bowed at the same time and said calmly, "Greetings, young master." Young master. Su Chu's face suddenly changed. Dongqing Yueshan, who had just stepped into the villa and saw this scene, was also shocked. Only Li Tianlan, the person involved, remained calm. He suppressed all his inner emotions at the bottom of his heart and always maintained extreme calmness and restraint. "Young master," he muttered to himself, then nodded and repeated, "Well, young master, from today on, you are the young governor of Sai City. From now on, there will always be a place for you on Mount Taibai." Tribulation looked at Li Tianlan, who was as calm as the deep sea in front of him, and said with unquestionable determination, "No matter what." Li Tianlan looked up at Tribulation. Tribulation was dressed in black, and the silver mask hid all his expressions, but his eyes were shining with cold and blazing light. No matter what. The meaning of these 4 words seemed to be more meaningful than the identity of the young governor of Sai City. And it was much more meaningful. From Qin Weibai's man to the young governor of Sai City. From a strange young heavenly son to the descendant of the Li family. This was especially so for the former. A private identity that was sufficiently illustrious but tainted with too much ambiguity had directly become an official identity that could not be underestimated. Li Tianlan could adapt to it, but he couldn't and didn't want to adapt to this change. There was still a mist in front of him, but some clear outlines had begun to appear in the mist. What? Li Tianlan suddenly asked. He was baffled by this question, but he believed that Tribulation could understand what he meant. I don't know. Tribulation was not at a loss, but he did not give any answer. Still too weak. Li Tianlan laughed at himself and said, "Too weak. Do you regret it?" Tribulation looked at Li Tianlan and asked. Li Tianlan's strength was actually not weak. If he did not choose to recultivate with his strength of the thunder-shocking realm and his current wind and thunder veins, even in this battle of Changdao, no one dared to ignore him, just like Wang Xingxiao now. Tribulation couldn't tell Li Tianlan any answer, but he knew that if Li Tianlan hadn't recultivated, this period of time, which was not wasted but could be regarded as tempering, was enough for Li Tianlan to go further in the thunder-shocking realm and even reach the stabilization phase. If Li Tianlan had not recultivated, everything that happened today might have been a different plan. I don't regret it. Li Tianlan shook his head and said softly, I just don't want to give up. After a long silence, Tribulation reached out and patted Li Tianlan on the shoulder, saying faintly, Time will prove everything. Li Tianlan smiled and said, I'm going to change clothes and then go to the meeting. Tribulation nodded and watched Li Tianlan's figure walk back into the villa. He walked so calmly, but no one could know that his heart had been twisted into a ball. That was the most direct pain and confusion. The moment he heard the words young governor of Sai City, he had already understood. Some things did not just leave him but were cut off. The most thorough, complete cut. Li Tianlan did not know the future, but he could feel that, at least for a long time, it was almost impossible for the things that were cut off to be reunited. Time passed by only for a moment. Li Tianlan's figure reappeared again. His expression was still calm, but his clothes had changed. A black suit, a black tie, and a white shirt. Li Tianlan, who was dressed so formally for the first time, did not look uncomfortable at all. The clean and tidy black made him look more spirited, and his eyes, which had always been calm and gentle, began to show sharpness gradually. Let's go. Li Tianlan walked to Tribulation and said, Su Chu and Rushi will go with me. Tribulation nodded, took out a willow leaf-shaped badge from his arms, and pinned it on Li Tianlan's chest. The lines of the badge were beautiful and smooth and the whole body was black. But the center of the badge was engraved with a thin but extremely bright white line, which ran directly through the whole willow leaf from top to bottom. Like the first ray of light in the darkness, it suddenly rose, vast and dazzling. This is the badge of Sai City. I should have given it to you earlier, but now it's not too late. Tribulation personally put the badge on Li Tianlan and said softly. Li Tianlan tightly pursed his lips and nodded. The badge was put on Li Tianlan's chest. This willow leaf seemed to be extraordinarily heavy, and a powerful force hit his heart. The sound of being cut seemed to ring in his ears again, and it was irresistible. Li Tianlan instinctively gritted his teeth and straightened his body. At this moment, everyone could clearly feel Li Tianlan's almost cold calmness. It seemed that he was suppressing something and also seemed to be enduring something. The morning sun turned into a scorching sun, and the sky was clear. The storm had stopped, but it was not over. In the hot and dull air, Li Tianlan walked out of the tree-lined courtyard and went straight to the venue. Beside him was Tribulation, the king of shadow in the dark world. They were Deep Dream and Sunset Shadow, the top assassins who had become more and more representative of Sai City in recent years. They were Dongqing Rushi and Su Chu, the two geniuses of the younger generation who had risen to fame. And in the venue in front of him, on the left and right, there were Ning Chenqing and Li Beidian, all his brothers. Through the sunlight outside the car window, Li Tianlan's eyes were unprecedentedly firm and cold. The venue was located on a mountain in the south of the club. The mountain was moderate in height, and the meeting room, which was like a hall, stood on the top of the mountain, full of mottled ancient traces. When Li Tianlan and the others arrived, there were still people coming in and out of the wide door of the meeting room. It seemed that Li Tianlan's initial speculation was not so correct. At least there were many people who could participate in this meeting, and only a few people could have decision-making power. Li Tianlan pushed the door and got out of the car. He walked to the door of the meeting room without hesitation, not even glancing at the scenery around the mountain top. Whether it was Tribulation, Deep Dream, Sunset Shadow, or Su Chu, they all consciously kept a distance from Li Tianlan and crowded around him. Only Dongqing Yueshan naturally held Li Tianlan's arm and followed him. Outside the door of the laboratory, more and more people began to stop. They looked at Li Tianlan and the top assassins of Sai City behind him with complicated eyes. Li Tianlan completely ignored everything. He walked in a straight line and walked into the door of the meeting room unhurriedly. Almost at the same time, another group of people stepped out of the door of the meeting room. The moment the two sides faced each other, the atmosphere seemed to freeze. Duke walked in the front, and beside him were Horsewoman and Flaming Fire. Duke looked at Li Tianlan with an indifferent expression. Li Tianlan was expressionless. The two sides, who should have been close, seemed to be hostile. The meeting room was a circular space, surrounded by layers of leather chairs. The outermost circle was the largest and had the most people sitting on it. The larger circle surrounded the smaller circle, and the deeper it was, the fewer seats there were. Everyone's status could be seen from where they sat. The one closest to the center of the circle naturally had a higher status. Li Tianlan glanced around and took a step directly. He was still walking in a straight line. The distance between Samsara Palace and Sai City was rapidly narrowing. Everyone noticed this scene. Regardless of whether they were inside or outside, everyone raised their heads and watched quietly. Duke didn't move. Li Tianlan moved forward. 7 meters. 5 meters. 3 meters. Li Tianlan's direction didn't change at all. He moved forward straight ahead. At the moment when the two sides were about to collide, there seemed to be a sigh in the air. Duke's body quietly gave way and walked to the side. Li Tianlan walked over calmly without stopping or looking back. Under the bright lights in the meeting room, Li Tianlan, in a black suit, walked through the outermost area, walked through the center and went straight to the core area of the meeting room. There were two people worthy of his attention. Wang Xingxiao, who represented the Wang family of Beihai. Gu Hanshan, who represented Kunlun City. And he who represented Sai City. In the silence, only the footsteps of Li Tianlan and his party echoed in the room. The light fell softly. At this moment, Li Tianlan was still unhurried, but his whole body seemed to have a trace of majesty and sharpness that was almost grand and magnificent. No one stopped Li Tianlan from moving forward. No one raised the slightest objection. On this day in Changdao, under the silent gaze of countless special warfare elites of Zhongzhou State, Li Tianlan walked into the meeting room that represented power, status and responsibility, and finally sat down in the most central area. There were many people around him, but there were only two young people. Wang Xingxiao, Gu Hanshan, dressed up. Li Qianlan's feet stepped on the ground, and his expression became more and more indifferent. The era was under his feet. As time went by, today was just the beginning. Chapter 199. At this moment, everyone's eyes were focused on Li Tianlan. The venue was quiet, but in the silence, there seemed to be a storm brewing and becoming turbulent. The lights above were getting brighter and brighter. A huge crystal chandelier was placed in the center of the ceiling. Around the chandelier, the ceiling was also covered with circles of small lights. When all the lights were on, the whole venue was full of light, without a trace of darkness. Faces of anger, coldness, excitement, jealousy, mockery, or hatred were clearly reflected under the lights of the venue, like the hundreds of expressions of all living beings. No one would question the strength of Sai City. They had the absolute strength to have a place in the center of the venue. But when Sai City and the descendant of the Li family came together, the emotions that emerged in most people's hearts were suspicion and hatred. Nearly 20 years had washed away the glory of the Li family, but the grievances and even hatred left at the beginning were still clear. For the special warfare system of Zhongzhou State, at least for a considerable number of people in the special warfare system, they could accept a young heavenly son with wind and thunder veins, but they could not accept a peerless genius with the inheritance of the Li family. It had nothing to do with position or hatred, but the overall situation. The name Li Tianlan now meant too many things. If it was expressed in the simplest words, it would be turbulence, change, and chaos. But the overall situation of Zhongzhou State was stable. The venue became silent and then cold. It was bitterly cold. In silence, Li Tianlan had already sat down in the center, waiting quietly. Countless eyes were intertwined and gathered on him. Li Tianlan was expressionless and faced it calmly. He was facing it, not bearing it. At this moment, no one knew how strong Li Tianlan's heart was and how fragile it was. He would rather face the entire world than bear even a tiny bit of it. He didn't want to, and he didn't dare to. Isn't this too ostentatious? In the center of the venue, Li Baidian frowned slightly and said to himself, sitting in a seat slightly behind Li Tianlan. The seats in the venue were round, and Li Baidian sat right opposite Li Tianlan. Looking at Li Tianlan's face, Li Baidian frowned. With his status, he really needs to show off for once. Next to Li Baidian, a middle-aged man who looked to be in his 40s smiled and said. The middle-aged man was a bit shorter than Li Baidian, so he wasn't very tall. However, his smiling face could be said to be elegant and extraordinarily handsome. The man wore a moon-white robe, and his hair was also as white as snow, so white that there wasn't a single impurity in it. White clothes, white hair, a face like jade, the man's every move was extremely restrained, without the slightest sword intent, but his entire person was like a famous sword that had been sheathed. Although he didn't reveal his edge, he had a kind of reserved and arrogant feeling. A simple and unadorned broad-edged long sword that was black and white was placed next to his hand. With the man and the sword matching each other, the middle-aged man's every word and action were full of confidence and elegance. The yin-yang sword master of Mount Shu, Han Chongyang. He was one of the strongest thunder-shocking realm experts in Zhongzhou State. He did not enter the list of the top 10 contemporary experts in Zhongzhou State, but what he lacked was not strength but prestige. Third senior brother seems to know something? Li Baidian looked at Han Chongyang in surprise. Nearly 30 swordsmen from Mount Shu entered Changdao this time, and less than 10 people entered the venue. But only Li Baidian could sit side by side with Han Chongyang. What can I know? Han Chongyang's smile remained unchanged, but his eyes became deeper and deeper. As the light flowed, he hid all his emotions. Shit, something is wrong no matter how I think about it. In front of his senior brother, Li Baidian had always been unscrupulous, to the extent that he had no taboo. What's going on? I thought Tianlan would come with the people from Samsara. Why is he with the people from Sai City? It's not that the people from Sai City are bad, but Tianlan and Goddess Qin were like glue not long ago. Why did he suddenly turn against them? Turn against them? Han Chongyang raised his eyebrows and chuckled in a low voice. What were you looking at just now? If they really turned against each other, would Li Tianlan dare to walk so close to Duke? At that distance, if Duke wanted to take action, no matter how talented Li Tianlan was, even if tribulation was by his side, he would definitely die. And who was Duke? He was the fourth supermaster of Samsara. If they really turned against each other, would he voluntarily make way for Li Tianlan? Boy, don't look at everything on the surface. Li Baidian was stunned. He didn't speak for a long time. He tried to recall the moment when Li Tianlan passed by the three super masters of samsara. After a long time he said softly, "Third senior brother, are you saying that Tianlan and samsara are acting? They did it on purpose? Samsara must have done it on purpose. Maybe Li Tianlan has noticed something?" "Noticed what? How do I know?" "You must know. I won't tell you even if I know." "What?" Li Baiqian's face turned red. After a long time he took a breath and shook his head. "It's still not right. Isn't his acting too clumsy? Third senior brother, can't so many people in the venue see what you can see? How is that reasonable? You have to see what they are looking at." Han Chongyang said slowly, "It also depends on what samsara is acting. You said yourself that Li Tianlan and the woman of samsara are very close. I heard that in the dark world she is like a goddess. Given their relationship, who can believe that they will break up completely? Samsara doesn't expect others to believe it. The woman of samsara wants to give Li Tianlan an identity that has nothing to do with samsara. But this identity must be strong enough, and Sai City is the best choice." "What's the point?" Li Baidian was still puzzled. "The point?" Han Chongyang said with a faint smile, "Of course it's meaningful. At least now Li Tianlan is a member of Sai City, and samsara has at least made a move to draw a clear line with Li Tianlan on the surface. At this time, whoever says that Li Tianlan has something to do with samsara will offend Sai City first." "But that's only on the surface?" Li Baidian looked at Han Chongyang. Han Chongyang nodded. His white hair rose gently, and there seemed to be sword intent dancing in his hair. "On the surface that's enough," he said slowly. This time, Li Baidian didn't ask whether it was meaningful or not. Instead he looked thoughtful. In his mind, samsara's inexplicable change was too abrupt. When the will of the master of Samsara Palace was silent, Qin Weibai was the will of Samsara Palace. There was no doubt about that. But at the very beginning, Qin Weibai was almost wild and unrestrained to get closer to Li Tianlan, and she even offered herself to Li Tianlan. How long had it been? Why did Qin Weibai want to draw a clear line with Li Tianlan? And she didn't really draw a clear line. What did she want to do? This change seemed to be around the time when Zhongzhou State plotted against East Island. But Samsara and Zhongzhou State cooperated to plot against East Island. No. Cooperation? Li Baidian suddenly looked up at Han Chongyang. His back was soaked in cold sweat almost instantly, and it even flowed down along his forehead. So far, Zhongzhou State and Samsara had indeed cooperated happily. But were they really cooperating? If Samsara really wanted to cooperate, why did she want to draw a clear line with Li Tianlan at this time? Samsara? Li Baidian opened his mouth and suddenly found his tone so weak. "Third senior brother, samsara is disloyal, isn't it? They have their standpoint." Han Chongyang's tone was calm. Standpoint has standpoint. Li Baiqian's mind was complicated and he didn't even know how he felt in his heart. This plot of Zhongzhou State is a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy from all sides and no one knows who will succeed until the end. "Hey, third senior brother, if samsara is disloyal, what will happen to Zhongzhou State? What's the standpoint of our Mount Shu?" Han Chongyang turned his head very slowly and looked at Li Baidian with no expression on his face. Li Baiqian's face gradually turned pale. "Nearly 3,000 people including Northern Europe, North America. Is it? Zhongzhou State will win." Han Chongyang suddenly said in a firm and erratic tone, "I don't have to help samsara. I don't have that obligation, right?" Li Baidian believed this 100%, but in his heart, it was only half a sentence. "If you don't help samsara, what about Zhongzhou State?" he suddenly asked. In his sight, Han Chongyang had turned his head. Li Baidian could only see Han Chongyang's cold side face and a long silence. He looked at Han Chongyang and then at Li Tianlan, but he suddenly thought of samsara. At this moment, Li Baidian felt crazy. Extreme crazy. "Why are you sitting here?" Perhaps it was because the silence in the venue had been too long, so when a voice that was not deliberately lowered suddenly sounded, it sounded particularly clear. This question was calm and indifferent, but there seemed to be a kind of extremely heavy power between the lines. The voice sounded right beside him. Li Tianlan slightly raised his eyebrows and casually turned his head. The gaze beside him fell straight on his face. It was calm and indifferent, without anger or hatred, but with a little doubt. The other party seemed to really wonder why Li Tianlan could sit here, and he had no other thoughts. This kind of gaze was undoubtedly the most hurtful. Gu Hanshan, the young master of Kunlun City. Everyone's spirits were lifted. It was as if the show they had been looking forward to for a long time had finally begun. The descendant of the Li family made a high-profile appearance on such an occasion. It was of extraordinary significance to the entire special warfare system of Zhongzhou State. Others might be dissatisfied or hostile, but they could bear it. At least they would not show up on such an occasion. But Kunlun City was different. Not to mention the inside story of Li Guangtu's treason, it was an indisputable fact that Gu Xingyun's rise and eventual overthrow of the Li family. When the Li family reappeared, everyone could remain silent, but Kunlun City could not. The silence of others could be regarded as wait and see. Once Kunlun City was silent, it might mean retreat and a guilty conscience in the eyes of others. Li Tianlan's appearance was undoubtedly the most variable that could affect Kunlun City's status today. He was the most direct threat, and once he grew up he could even be said to be the most deadly threat. Mortal enemy. Such a relationship could not be concealed even if they wanted to. Kunlun City had to speak today. No matter whether their words were useful or not, they had to express their attitude at least. Who are you? Li Tianlan's expression did not change, and he asked indifferently. His expression and tone were also sincere. Except for doubt, there was no other emotion. But these two short sentences were instantly full of a sense of tit for tat. It was impossible for Gu Hanshan not to see Sai City beside Li Tianlan. It was also impossible for Li Tianlan not to know Gu Hanshan. One was intentionally provoking him, while the other was blatantly looking down on him. Gu Hanshan's eyes flickered, but he remained calm. The appearance of the young master of Kunlun City was indeed unremarkable and ordinary, but his eyes were full of absolute sharpness and dominance. He sat quietly in his seat, but he gave people an indescribable sense of mystery and danger. His eyes, which could leave a deep impression at any time, slowly glanced around. Some people in charge of special warfare agencies at the back of the venue seemed to want to stand up, but when they saw Gu Hanshan shake his head slightly, they sat back down. Gu Hanshan's eyes kept sweeping over several positions in the core area of the venue. The most central position of the venue was extremely limited, and it actually belonged to several superpowers. The Wang family of Beihai, Kunlun City, and Sai City, the three superpowers with experts of the invincible realm, naturally deserved this position. In addition, Samsara must also have a place. Azure Dragon Gong Sun-Chi of Zhongzhou State and his Terracotta Army were the nominal supreme leaders of this action, so they naturally had to be in the most central position. In addition, there was originally Mount Shu. But this time it was Han Chongyang, the Yin and Yang Sword Master, who came to Changdao, not Wei Kunlun, the Nirvana Sword Master. So Mount Shu's position consciously moved backward. In this way the situation suddenly became clear. Each of the 5 superpowers who were qualified to sit in the most central position could at least send a top expert of the half-step invincible realm. The Wang family of Beihai sent Firmament, and the Enchantress also vaguely had the combat capability close to the half-step invincible realm. Tribulation sent Deep Dream and Sunset Shadow were also the most outstanding assassins in Sai City in recent years. Samsara had Saint in charge, and in today's meeting, they were currently waiting for another important figure from Samsara. As for himself, the combination of Ice Crystal and Ice Frost Sword could be said to be a half-step invincible realm expert. In addition, his uncle Gu Zhendong was also here. Gu Hanshan's eyes gradually burst out a trace of presumptuous brilliance. He quietly glanced in the direction of the Wang family of Beihai. Wang Shengxiao yawned a little bored and whispered something to Firmament and the Enchantress beside him, as if he didn't care about the tension here at all. The Terracotta Army was destined to be neutral. As for Samsara, judging from the atmosphere between them and Li Tianlan just now, it seemed unlikely that they would make a move today. In this way there was only Sai City left. Gu Hanshan suddenly smiled and his eyes became sharper. A smile appeared on his plain face, and there was an indescribable kind of exuberance. I'm the young governor of Kunlun City. What qualification do you have to sit next to me? It's a joke that the descendant of a traitor wants to enter the room. Gu Hanshan's tone gradually became cold. It's a shame to sit with you. Now I have a suggestion. He moved his fingers and said indifferently, get out. In the future when you rush forward you should first ask yourself, do you deserve it? His voice echoed so clearly in the audience, calm and soft, but with a strong sense of humiliation and mockery. Tribulation moved his body. When he was about to get up, Li Tianlan suddenly reached out and pressed his shoulder. What if I don't get out? He asked calmly. Descendant of a traitor, do you deserve it? Gu Hanshan looked at Li Tianlan lightly and asked. I'm here now. Do you want to see for yourself whether I deserve it or not? Li Tianlan's eyes became colder and colder. Gu Hanshan laughed and said the same thing, "Descendant of a traitor, do you deserve it?" He smiled gently, but his eyes were full of disdain and disdain. "Well said. Descendant of a traitor, do you deserve to sit here? Get out." In the corner of the middle of the venue, a bald man suddenly stood up and shouted angrily. "Today I finally know what shamelessness is. How dare you show up here? Think of the innocent souls killed by your father. Now, Li Tianlan, do you deserve it?" Another middle-aged woman stepped forward with a vicious sneer on her face. "Ha ha, a peerless genius with wind and thunder veins? You scared me. Do you deserve to be compared with the Wang family of Beihai and the young master of Kunlun City? Bullshit. They will be heavenly sons when they grow up. What about you? You're a scourge. Get out. Do you deserve to come to this venue? Get out. Traitor. Do you deserve it?" A terrible sound suddenly rolled up in the venue. The storm that had been brewing for a long time broke out completely. All the special warfare agencies related to Kunlun City stood up, and the sound was like a tide. The era of the Li family had long passed. Now in Zhongzhou State there was only Kunlun City. They didn't need the Li family, nor did they welcome the former war god family. The sound waves spread layer by layer. For a moment, the words, "Do you deserve it?" seemed to be the only thing in the world, echoing in Li Tianlan's ears. But the clearest voice was Gu Hanshan's. He still smiled gently, looked at Li Tianlan calmly and mockingly and said, "Do you deserve it?" Li Tianlan also smiled. Bearing the condemnation around him, the corners of his mouth rose, and he smiled happily and comfortably. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, he stood up. At the same time, a dazzling and sharp sword light also rose up. The sword light was like a waterfall. In an instant it rose from the ground to the roof. All the lights were dim and the whole conference room seemed to be split in half by a sword. The sword light crossed the venue but did not disappear. Instead, it completely condensed. There was no high temperature, no intention, only the purest sword intent rose to the peak in an instant, with a sharpness that could tear everything. The 13th blade, reverse scale. Under the bright sword light, there seemed to be darkness spreading around Li Tianlan. His figure disappeared for a moment. Gu Hanshan had already risen into the air. The raging fire suddenly burst out from his body, illuminating everything, but it could not illuminate the darkness around Li Tianlan. The sword light brought with it a strong killing intent and a violent rage. It flashed and disappeared from top to bottom. Light and fire blended with each other. The moment the sword light disappeared, countless sparks exploded around Gu Hanshan, splashing in all directions. The sword light suddenly spread all over the venue, and countless chairs exploded layer by layer. The clothes of some peripheral elites of Kunlun City sitting behind Gu Hanshan were all torn, and they looked embarrassed. In the fire, Gu Hanshan, who had risen into the air, fell down at a faster speed. His body landed steadily on the ground, but 2 streaks of blood shot out of his nostrils. Gu Hanshan glanced at Li Tianlan, and when he was about to speak, he suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood. The audience was in an uproar. The young master of Kunlun City was defeated. Gu Hanshan glanced at Li Tianlan expressionlessly, closed his mouth tightly, and sat down with the help of ice crystal and ice frost. Before entering Changdao, he had been chased by Heavenly Hound, the left advisor of Wuji Palace, for many days. Although he successfully entered Changdao under the cover of ice crystal and ice frost, he had not recovered yet. In a hurry he faced Li Tianlan's full sword strike, and he could not exert his peak strength, so he suffered a loss. Li Tianlan's body was still standing in the air. The sword light and the fire had all disappeared. But the air around him was violently twisted. At the place closest to the chandelier in the venue, a void of darkness almost completely covered his body. In the darkness, everyone could feel a pair of cold and indifferent eyes staring at them. That pair of eyes was constant and awe-inspiring, with inviolable pride and majesty. At this moment, no one in the venue was willing to face that pair of eyes. A clear, arrogant, calm and crazy voice rang in everyone's ears, one word at a time like thunder. "My grandfather is Li Honghe. My father is Li Guangtu. My name is Li Tianlan." In the darkness, his voice paused and then he said gloomily, "You? Who do you think you are?" Some people were in a trance. Some people looked furious. Some people looked cold. However, what most people felt was fear. Among all the people present, only one person looked sad, self-deprecating and helpless. That was Thunder God. Chapter 200. Swords were drawn. The atmosphere in the venue was completely frozen. Gu Hanshan slowly wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth and sat in his seat with a cold expression. He really did not expect that Li Tianlan would dare to fight on such an occasion. It was not a big deal for him to suffer losses and get hurt, but it made him extremely angry to lose face. After today, everyone present would think that he, the young master of Kunlun Immortal World, had lost to Li Tianlan. The sword just now was brilliant, but it also cast a shadow over his reputation as a young heavenly son. There were real reasons why he had not recovered from his serious injury and was caught off guard. But in the dark world, where the winner was king, what was the use of constantly emphasizing objective reasons? Not to mention whether anyone would believe it even if someone did, so what? A defeat was a defeat. Gu Hanshan twitched the corner of his mouth, and a violent killing intent flashed in his eyes. He closed his mouth tightly and said nothing. Li Tianlan still stood in the air. The darkness around him spread faster and faster, and the airflow kept twisting around him as if to cover the whole venue. This was indescribable pride and arrogance. He was insufferably arrogant and had no one in his eyes. Just like what he said. Who do you think you are? The whole venue was silent for a moment. Then a furious roar suddenly sounded in the venue. Bastard, who do you think you are? In fact, there were two voices, but both the tone and the tone were almost exactly the same. When the two voices were combined, it was like a person roaring. The roar condensed with strong killing intent surged in the venue, and the echo of the roar was still floating in the air. Two beams of sword light had appeared in front of Li Tianlan at the same time. Tribulation, dressed in black, moved his body as if he wanted to get up, but he restrained his desire to make a move. The somewhat hot temperature dropped instantly, and for a moment, the whole venue seemed to enter a frost kingdom. The sword light scattered, and the darkness around Li Tianlan was constantly compressed. Streaks of sword energy with cold intent almost completely enveloped his body. In his sight, two figures appeared in front of him. Exactly the same face. Identical swords. Ice Spirit. Frost. Although the two swords had not merged into one when they attacked at the same time, the sword intents of the same origin merged with each other, and this sword still burst out the power beyond the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. There were only the tips of the two swords left in Li Tianlan's pupils. The tip of the sword pierced through the air, bringing with it a pale, cold and sinister sword aura, and directly pierced towards his left and right heart. Faint exclamations of surprise rang out in the venue. His resolute killing intent swept across the entire area. For Li Tianlan, this sword strike was a sure kill. It was not only because the attacker was the famous Ice Crystal Frost Sword of Kunlun City, but also because this sword was similar to a sneak attack. The moment the sword energy flashed, the edge of the Ice Crystal Frost Sword had almost reached Li Tianlan's chest. The speed of this sword was completely indescribable, and it had even vaguely exceeded the scope of the thunder-shocking realm. Such a sword, which could be called the trump card, could not be used without paying a price, even if it was the Ice Crystal Frost Sword. To kill Li Tianlan, Kunlun City could hardly care less about its identity and face. The sword light was like a shooting star. But time seemed to be slowed down by countless times. The darkness around Li Tianlan kept retreating under the pressure of the sword light, and the scene in front of him became extremely clear. At this moment, Li Tianlan could clearly see the pale, cold sword energy condensing around him. He could even clearly see the natural lines on the edge of the Ice Crystal Frost Sword and the gloomy and vicious eyes of the person behind the two swords. The two swords pushed forward at the same time. A cold and chilly sword light shone in the venue. The sword light was like ice and snow, and the sword intent was as cold as winter. In front of the two sword lights that were as dazzling and cold as the winter sun, Li Tianlan felt destruction and also saw a slender and vigorous palm. In the white sword light with a trace of coldness in the snow, the hand appeared abruptly and naturally. It was a very clean and neat palm with a clear outline. Although it was not big, every knuckle was full of power. In the sword light that enveloped everything around, this hand directly reached in. In an instant, the surrounding sword intent all became chaotic. The palm slowly closed in the sword intent that was as cold as ice. Li Tianlan could almost clearly feel that the surrounding sword intent was completely crushed by this palm. The airflow around the palm twisted rapidly and finally formed a transparent whirlpool. In the extremely quiet space, the whirlpool suddenly spun wildly. The Ice Crystal Sword and the Ice Frost Sword that were close to Li Tianlan's chest suddenly began to tremble violently. The stalemate lasted no more than 3 seconds. With a muffled groan from the Ice Frost Sword and the Ice Crystal Frost Sword, which were close to Li Tianlan's chest, the two swords suddenly lost control and clung to each other, falling into the palm that suddenly appeared. The sword intent brought by the ice crystal frost sword collapsed completely. A cold current suddenly rose in the venue, and the air was twisted into a circle of obvious airwaves. The airwaves were like tides, spreading to the whole venue with a powerful force. The whole venue was suddenly in chaos. Countless chairs were smashed under the impact of the airwaves. Some people in the middle of the venue even directly stood up to resist the sudden and rapid burst of power. Some elites of Zhongzhou State who were close to the door were even unable to resist. Under the impact of the almost majestic power, their whole bodies were lifted up, and they were thrown out of the door together with the pieces of chairs. The figures of the ice frost sword and the ice crystal sword were also blasted out more than 10 meters away, smashing into empty tables and chairs in the venue, bringing up a lot of smoke. Li Tianlan had already landed on the ground. A black figure walked past him at the same time as he landed and stopped in a small open space in the center of the venue. It was a figure wrapped in a black cloak. He was thin, mysterious, and strange. This was a figure that looked very lonely, but the moment Li Tianlan saw him, he felt that he saw a sea. Deep, surging, turbulent, and unfathomable. Saint? Wang Xingxiao, who seemed not to notice Li Tianlan, but in fact had been paying attention to everything in the venue, suddenly raised his eyebrows and whispered to himself. No. Firmament, who was sitting beside him, shook his head slowly. The moment just now might seem long, but in fact it was just a split second. But in that instant, it was enough for Firmament to feel the powerful and almost irresistible power of the other party. That was pure power and skill, not sword intent. This is military counselor. Firmament said with a serious expression. Military counselor, who ranked second only to Saint among the 12 supermasters of Samsara, was also the most mysterious supermaster in Samsara. It could be said that today was the military counselor's first real fight. Before that, many people had even speculated whether the military counselor was an ordinary person without the strength to truss a chicken. There were even voices that speculated that Qin Weibai was the military counselor. But the supermaster of Samsara had completely proved how powerful he was in that moment of attack. In terms of strength, he was even a supermaster who was not weaker than the first supermaster, Saint. Your Excellency, who are you? From the sneak attack of Ice Crystal Sword and Ice Frost to the appearance of the black-robed man, everything happened in the blink of an eye. When Ice Crystal Sword and Ice Frost landed on the ground, everyone finally reacted. Beside Gu Hanshan, Gu Jindong, who had been silent, suddenly took a step forward, staring at the black-robed man who suddenly appeared and asked in a low voice. Gu Jindong was extremely burly with thick eyebrows and big eyes. He looked like a valiant general, but in fact for the dark world and the special warfare system of Zhongzhou State, this was a relatively strange name. In recent years in Kunlun City, Gu Xingyun and Gu Qianchuan, two invincible realm experts, were enough to control any situation. Below them, there were some thunder-shocking realm experts who had just joined Kunlun City in recent years. In this way, except for a few direct descendants of Kunlun City who walked outside, other people rarely appeared, and Gu Jindong was one of them. But their absence did not mean that they were not powerful. In a way, people like Gu Jindong were the real core of Kunlun City, as well as the foundation of Kunlun City. For the superpowers in the dark world, an opponent that was not understood was the most terrifying opponent. I'm military counselor. The man in the cloak said calmly. His voice was clear and elegant, giving people a feeling of extreme calmness and wisdom. Military counselor? Gu Jindong frowned and repeated, military counselor of Samsara? Not only military counselor of Samsara. He's also the military counselor of this operation. Military counselor's tone was indifferent. Gu Jindong was silent and didn't speak for a long time. Although he didn't come out often in Kunlun City, his authority was extremely high. And before today's meeting, some superpowers roughly knew the content of this meeting. Today, nearly 2,000 elites of Zhongzhou State in Changdao were led by Gong Sun Qi, the Azure Dragon of Zhongzhou State. Gong Sun Qi had the leadership, but military counselor had the command. Zhongzhou State attached great importance to this conflict that swept the entire dark world. Yi Dongxing, known as the God of Army, was in the rear while military counselor came to the front. The highlight of today's meeting was to successfully connect military counselor in Changdao with God of Army in Zhongzhou State, make a battle plan according to the current situation, and emphasize military counselor's command. The final battle was about force as well as wisdom. Moreover, Zhongzhou State had newly established the Snowdance Corps, and Gu Qianchuan was the first commander of the corps at a price. Giving up the leadership of East Island was one of the conditions put forward by Samsara when they cooperated with Zhongzhou state. In other words, military counselor who had the command could actually be on an equal footing with Gong Sunqi, at least in East Island. From the perspective of this final battle, it was not an exaggeration to say that everyone in Kunlun City was now military counselor's subordinates. Gu Zhendong felt depressed, but he didn't want to show weakness. He glared at military counselor and said with a cold smile, "So what if you're military counselor? You have the command power in this final battle, but do you also have the power to intervene in our internal affairs?" He pointed at Li Tianlan and said coldly, "Do you want to stand up for this man?" Everyone had noticed the fact that Samsara had cut off Li Tianlan. Although they didn't know what Samsara was going to do, military counselor had just saved Li Tianlan once. In any case, this should be against Samsara's current plan. Military counselor denied it as expected and said in a calm tone, "I don't stand up for anyone, but your dog blocked my way. Is it wrong for me to kick it away?" Dog. It seemed to be the first time that the famous Ice Crystal and Frost Sword of Kunlun City were called dogs since they became famous. Even when they joined forces and still lost to Wei Kunlun, the Nirvana Sword Master of Mount Shu, no one dared to humiliate them like this. Gu Zhendong's face was cold. Ice Crystal and Ice Frost, who had just climbed up from the mess, also looked furious. The three of them looked at each other and rushed to military counselor almost at the same time without any hesitation. "Kill!" Gu Zhendong roared furiously, and a bolt of blue lightning with a hint of strange purple suddenly formed in front of him. In an instant, the air in front of him surged backward, and only the purple lightning was growing rapidly. Gu Zhendong took a step forward, and the extremely dazzling lightning shot out instantly, as if it had passed through the void, and reached military counselor in an instant. Military counselor's figure seemed to be blurred in place as if he had moved, but also as if he hadn't moved. But the lightning had already passed him and flew behind him. Gu Zhendong was expressionless. Behind him, Ice Crystal and Ice Frost had already rushed up. Full force, no. Military counselor's eyebrows twitched suddenly. At such a delicate moment he found that although Ice Crystal and Ice Frost's posture was extremely firm, they were not attacking but defending. Defending against what? Almost instinctively military counselor's heart shook, and he said subconsciously, "Be careful." As soon as his voice came out, the purple lightning that passed through military counselor's figure had suddenly changed direction. The purple light instantly enveloped the whole venue. In the blurry light, Gu Zhendong's purple lightning had exploded into a light curtain. In the light curtain, killing intent was flowing, and thousands of sword intents covered Li Tianlan at the same time. It was still Li Tianlan. Gu Zhendong was expressionless, but there was determination in his eyes. From the standpoint of Kunlun City, Li Tianlan had to be killed no matter what, regardless of the occasion or place. As long as there was a chance, there should be no hesitation. Today's series of means might be despicable, but as long as Li Tianlan died, who would remember it as time passed? But Li Tianlan had to die. Not to mention how great a threat Li Tianlan would be to Kunlun City in the future. Even now, his existence would become a weapon used by some people with ulterior motives. There were too many inside stories behind Li Guangtu's incident. These years, Kunlun City had barely suppressed it. They thought that with the passage of time, this incident would become a thing of the past. But Li Tianlan's appearance was tantamount to giving others a reason to mention this incident again. For this reason alone, everyone in Kunlun City would feel terrified at the thought of it. They were not afraid of Li Tianlan's potential, but afraid of the series of unknown variables. As long as there was a chance to kill Li Tianlan, Gu Zhendong would not hesitate at all. In contrast, a little insult to Ice Crystal and Ice Frost was nothing. Whoosh! At the same time as the purple light exploded, an extremely sharp whistle sounded in the venue. A thick darkness directly wrapped Li Tianlan in it. Thousands of purple lights kept hitting the dark curtain around Li Tianlan. The black curtain shook violently and instantly shrank. In Gu Zhendong's gloomy expression, the black curtain wrapped in purple light flew to the top of the conference room at an extremely fast speed. Before everyone looked up, the black curtain had rushed out of the ceiling of the conference room. In the loud bang, a hole with a radius of about 10 meters was blown out of the ceiling. The sunlight from the outside world came in through the hole and perfectly blended with the light in the rising smoke and dust. Tribulation was already standing beside Li Tianlan. Under the mask, no one could see the expression of the King of Shadow clearly, but there was an undisguised violent killing intent in his low and hoarse voice. Tianlan is the young governor of Sai City. Gu Zhendong, you can kill him if you want. Do you really think that there is no one in Sai City? 4 consecutive transparent shadows surrounded Gu Zhendong at the first time. Tribulation's arms hung down, and 2 armed knives suddenly stuck out of his cuffs. Tianlan is my brother. Gu Zhendong, you can kill him if you want. Do you really think that there is no one in Mount Shu? On the other side of the conference room, Li Baidian suddenly pulled out the long sword beside him. Of course, this sword was not the Great Void Sword. But as the blade was unsheathed, Li Baidian's whole body emitted a kind of majestic sword intent that could almost go straight to the 9th heaven. Beside him, the Yin and Yang sword master of Mount Shu, Han Chongyang, sat still. All the swordsmen of Mount Shu around him also sat still, but their sword intent was concentrated on Li Baidian at the same time. At this moment, Li Baidian raised the long sword high. The bright blade trembled, and the amazing sword energy instantly crossed the distance of more than 10 meters and pointed directly at Gu Zhendong's throat. Tianlan is my brother. Gu Zhendong, you can kill him if you want. Do you really think that there is no one in the Eastern Theater of Operations? Ning Qianxing slowly stood up from the front seat of the Eastern Theater of Operations and said in a cold tone. The elites of the Eastern Theater of Operations came out in full force this time. Although there were only 2 thunder-shocking realm experts, more than 100 fire-flaming realm experts were a force that no one dared to ignore. When this force was all gathered together, no expert of the half-step invincible realm dared to fight head-on. Tianlan is my fiancé. Gu Zhendong, you can kill him if you want. Do you really think that there is no one in the Dongqing clan? Dongqing Yueshan and Thunder God stood up almost at the same time. Sai City, Mount Shu, the Eastern Theater of Operations, the Dongqing clan. The whole venue suddenly became noisy, and the sound of discussion rang out in every corner. Plus, there was Samsara whose attitude was ambiguous. Whether it was inside Zhongzhou State or outside Zhongzhou State, once this force was united, it could completely compete with Kunlun City. As long as Li Tianlan grew up. No wonder Kunlun City was so impatient that they even used some unpresentable means. The sounds of discussion came one after another, becoming more and more chaotic. Gu Zhendong, who took the initiative to sneak attack but failed again, glanced coldly at Tribulation standing beside Li Tianlan, and then looked at Wang Xingxiao. The force around Li Tianlan was obvious enough. If he really became powerful, then not only Kunlun City would be in trouble, but the Wang family of Beihai would also be in trouble. At this time, the Wang family of Beihai should always come out and say something. Wang Shengxiao looked at Gu Zhendong strangely and suddenly said with a smile, "Why are you looking at me like this? Do you think that there is no one in the Wang family of Beihai?" Gu Zhendong was so angry that he almost vomited blood. He suddenly turned around and was about to speak, when a noise louder than the discussion suddenly rang out in the conference room. Everyone was taken aback and subconsciously raised their heads. In the center of the conference room, just above the military counselor's position, a hanging big screen had been turned on. The volume of the conference room was very loud, and the voice of the East Island host on the screen clearly echoed in every corner of the conference room. And the translator in the conference room immediately translated the host's Japanese into Chinese and spread it to the whole conference room. All the voices of discussion gradually disappeared. People's expressions began to change gradually, from the confusion at the beginning to surprise, then to seriousness and finally to solemnity. At 10 o'clock this morning, the East Island military held a press conference. The military spokesman said that in the next 7 days, there would be a large-scale anti-terrorism military exercise in Changdao. At present, the relevant departments were evacuating the people, and part of Changdao would be turned into the exercise area. There was silence in the conference room, and only the voice of the host and the translator echoed. Evacuate the people for the exercise. This reason seemed far-fetched, but it was a reason after all. And don't forget, this was Changdao, the most sparsely populated place in the whole East Island, and the place where they were hiding right now had even fewer people living nearby. If East Island used this area as a maneuver area, then the number of people who would be evacuated in the end would only be 100 or 200, and it would be a piece of cake. Obviously, East Island had begun to prepare for the battlefield. 7 days, the picture on the screen suddenly stopped. Gong Sun Chi's figure appeared at the door of the conference room. Looking at the messy scene in the conference room and the scary big hole in the ceiling, this azure dragon of Zhongzhou State smiled softly and walked into the conference room. His voice was gentle and there seemed to be a little smile in it. Today is the first day. East Island people are preparing for the battlefield, and other dark forces are also preparing for the war. We Zhongzhou State. Ha! He walked to military counselor and stopped. He glanced around and asked with a smile, "What are we doing in Zhongzhou State?" The whole conference room was quiet. Gu Zhendong, who didn't want to stop, hesitated and slowly sat down. Even tribulation pulled Li Tianlan to sit in his seat. Gong Sunqi was known as the person who was closest to the invincible realm in the dark world, and he could even be said to be the first person in the half-step invincible realm. Whether or not people were convinced by this title, he was now the supreme leader in the Battle of Changdao. People still had to show him the respect he deserved. Tribulation patted Li Tianlan's shoulder gently, turned his head and glanced at Gu Zhendong coldly. Gu Zhendong stared back at Tribulation without avoiding him, but his eyes were thoughtful. Although the fight with Tribulation was short, he had keenly sensed that something was wrong with Tribulation's state. When Tribulation attacked with all his strength, he seemed to be extremely powerful but also extremely weak. This state made people feel quite weird. It was like one step to heaven and one step to hell, and Tribulation was standing on a wire rope between heaven and hell, swaying back and forth between glory and eternal damnation. Not to mention Tribulation's own mood, even the others were a little scared when they saw this. This state, Tribulation seemed to be injured? Although I have the title of leader, I don't think I can lead you. I can't intervene in your grievances. But now, in the face of the war, I, Gong Sunqi, beg you to put national affairs first, and I hope you can put some grievances behind the war. Gong Sunqi turned 360 degrees and gave a military salute to the meeting place. He put down his arm and continued to say with a smile, I wonder if you are willing to do me this favor? No one spoke. There was silence in the meeting place. Gong Sunqi nodded and said, I'll take it as a yes. He waved the thick pile of materials in his hand and continued, let me introduce today's meeting. Military Counselor of Samsara Supermaster will meet with our God of Army, Marshal Yi Dongxing, in this meeting to make the next battle plan. And in my hand is some intelligence, including the experts of East Island and other martial arts forces who are in East Island at this time. Of course, the intelligence is not complete, but it's better to know more than nothing. Here, on behalf of Zhongzhou State, I thank Samsara Palace for the intelligence. If you don't mind, let's start the meeting now. We don't have much time, so we have to hurry. The scene on the screen of the meeting place changed. Yi Dongxing, the god of army of Zhongzhou State, who wore a military uniform and the rank of marshal, appeared on the screen. Through the screen, he obviously noticed the countless broken seats in the meeting place. He was a little stunned, but he didn't say much. He just looked away and looked at military counselor standing next to Gong Sunqi. Your Excellency Military Counselor, please take care of me. He said calmly and raised his hand to give a salute. Take care of each other. Military Counselor bowed slightly, looking calm and indifferent. Military Counselor and God of Army. The moment the two successfully met, even the slowest people in the meeting place felt the pressure and coldness of the approaching final battle. This was bound to be a long meeting. Li Tianlan had calmed down and listened carefully. Time passed slowly. He rarely spoke on behalf of Sai City, and most of the time he was taking notes. The scorching sun turned into the setting sun in the meeting place. The fiery color in the sky gradually dimmed. The setting sun was about to disappear, but the bright moon had already risen. After the storm, East Island began to welcome dusk for the first time. Finally it became dark. When the night fell, it was also the time when the morning light was approaching. Time passed through the night in the meeting place and it was close to dawn. Chapter 201. Time passed by the gorgeous rainy season, and the sky of Changdao was getting clearer and clearer. In the summer after the storm, the temperature rose quickly, and the hot sun shone on every corner of Changdao. Hot, dull, and depressing had become the theme of Changdao. The news about the military exercise of Changdao had been playing on TV. At 9 o'clock in the morning, when the news channel spread the news to every city in East Island again, there were still 6 days before the military exercise of Changdao. It was like a notice, but for some people, it was the most straightforward countdown. The war was coming. In the dull and hot weather, a large area in the southwest of Changdao had been completely emptied. It was an area of about 100 square kilometers and most of it was mountainous. Usually there were few people in this area. After the military of East Island designated this area as the military exercise area, the scattered civilians and a small village had all been evacuated. At this moment, under the clear sky, the mountains and rivers in this area were still the same, but the residents had all disappeared. It was like a dead zone full of vitality, but no one was there. Those who didn't know would never understand, but those who knew would know that this was the battlefield that the East Island officials had set in Changdao. It was an area with a radius of 100 square kilometers. It was a magnificent place. And this area had become a place where all the superpowers were studying. The map zoomed and enlarged on the screen, and the satellite images were transmitted in real time. Every corner of the southwest of Changdao was clearly shown on the screen as it zoomed in and out. The shabby curtains in the room were casually covered, blocking the hot and dazzling sunlight from the outside. An LCD screen that occupied almost the whole wall kept flashing. Jungles, mountains, rivers, lakes, parks, clubhouses. The satellite took pictures of all the terrains within a radius of 100 square kilometers and transmitted them to the screen. As the camera moved bit by bit, every part of the terrains became clear on the screen. The light in the empty room was dim. Only the misty light on the screen flickered, reflecting the entire room. The LCD screen that occupied the front wall could be said to be a very advanced device, but it seemed very out of place in the room. In terms of area, this was a rather large room or even a hall, but there were no luxurious decorations in the hall. The curtains by the windows were dirty, and there was a set of shabby sofas that seemed to have been abandoned in the middle of the room. There seemed to be some spider webs in the corner, and in the dim environment the surrounding walls seemed to have mostly peeled off. In such an environment, coupled with an advanced and luxurious LCD screen that was connected to a satellite, it seemed a little strange no matter how one looked at it. Several tall and short figures stood quietly in the hall. The hall was not small and they did not stand together. Instead, they maintained a safe distance from each other. Although they were all on guard against each other, no one revealed any hostility. The image on the screen changed. It was silent. The few figures in the hall also stood silently on the spot, as if they were inanimate objects. Time continued to move forward as the screen continued to change. Light and shadow flickered in the dim hall, and the few figures stood still, looking gloomy and weird. This area is the battlefield that East Island left for us. In the oppressive and breathless silence, a person standing in the hall suddenly spoke, breaking the silence in the hall. He was the closest to the screen, and the light and shadow on the screen shone on him. His extremely skinny body also became clear in the light and shadow. From the view of the others, he looked like a skeleton in a black robe. The body under the black robe was empty, and there was an indescribable coldness about him. It looks big. That includes our current location. Another hoarse voice rang out. This voice was hoarse and strange, as if someone had torn off his vocal cords. It was a little unclear, and not only was it unpleasant to hear, it was even more terrifying to hear. But I still prefer to choose my own battlefield. I don't like this place. Ben, is the Heroes Club willing to accept the arrangement of East Island? Ben, the vice president of the American Heroes Club, and the first vice president at that, was the most powerful figure in the entire Dark World. The Heroes Club could be said to be one of the oldest superpowers in the Dark World. Its internal structure was extremely complicated, and its strength was also extremely powerful. At its peak decades ago, its power could be described as overwhelming in America, and it was the most powerful superpower in the entire Dark World. Today's Heroes Club wasn't as dazzling as it was at its peak, but it didn't go downhill either. In the past 20 years, the Heroes Club's power kept expanding. 10 years ago, it opened up Africa, 5 years ago, and it entered Northern Europe. Its sphere of power was getting bigger and bigger. In America, where they first made their fortune, the Heroes Club had maintained a fairly transcendent position, whether it was South America or North America. This time, the plot of Zhongzhou State affected the entire Dark World. The Heroes Club had already regarded the Battle of Changdao as an opportunity for them to penetrate into Asia. Ben, the first vice president, led the team to Changdao, which showed how cautious the Heroes Club was about the Battle of Changdao. The situation of the Dark World in Asia had been stable and weird for the past countless years. West Asia was in constant war, and it could be said to be the paradise of the Dark World. South Asia was full of fights for power and interests. The Dark World and politics were closely related, complicated and sensitive. In these two places, West Asia meant chaos. Although this word was the eternal theme of the Dark World, for the dark superpowers, excessive chaos also meant limited interests and possible unexpected losses. South Asia, on the other hand, meant trouble. The political factors, religious factors, ethnic hatred, and historical grievances combined to make the entire Dark World of South Asia extremely crazy. Although the superpowers in the Dark World were unwilling to give up these two areas, they hadn't been very diligent in their management for many years. As for East Asia and North Asia, they were the most stable places. North Asia and Eastern Europe had a large territory of snow country, which was the sphere of influence of the Polar Ground Alliance, the superpower in the Dark World. In the whole of North Asia and Eastern Europe, the Polar Ground Alliance could be said to be the only superpower. In addition, Snow Country's political situation had been stable in recent years, so other superpowers couldn't find a chance to enter North Asia. Even if there was a chance, the Polar Ground Alliance, which was born as a fighting nation, would often take the initiative to attack and stop all threats outside its sphere of influence. East Asia, on the other hand, seemed to have been drifting away from the superpowers in the Dark World in the past. Because Zhongzhou State, the world's well-deserved #1 superpower in both economy and military, was located here. Whether in the past or now, Zhongzhou State had only one superpower in the Dark World. That was the Wang family of Beihai. Whether it was the former Zhuanyuantai of Kunlun, the current Kunlun City, or Sai City, they could all be said to be dark superpowers, but most of the time, in people's hearts, these superpowers were part of the special warfare system of Zhongzhou State, with a very strong official stance. The Wang family of Beihai in Zhongzhou State, the special warfare system of Zhongzhou State. The two superpowers in Zhongzhou State were enough to keep out any superpower that attempted to enter Zhongzhou State. The superpowers had fought with Zhongzhou State before, and this kind of competition still existed today. More than 20 years ago, when the Heroes Club was at its peak, it once joined forces with Fantasy World and the Polar Ground Alliance to invade Zhongzhou State. The old patriarch of the Wang family of Beihai and Li Honghe, the god of war of Zhongzhou State, joined hands and stopped several invincible realm experts outside the national border. In that battle, the old patriarch of the Wang family of Beihai fought desperately against the siege of 3 invincible realm experts and returned with serious injuries after killing 2 invincible realm experts. A few years later, he died of illness. The Heroes Club, whose power was greatly reduced, also fell from its peak. 15 years ago, Night Spirit invaded Zhongzhou State. Zhongzhou State Sword Emperor Wang Tianzong, who had just entered the Invincible Realm, held the Human Emperor and killed Night Spirit, an invincible realm expert of Night Spirit, at the border with one spear strike, which shocked the whole Dark World. After a short silence, the Jiang family of South America began to be active in Zhongzhou State again, but it was always difficult to make a name for itself. 5 years ago, Samsara began to cooperate with Zhongzhou State, but it was guarded by Kunlun City and the Wang family of Beihai. Although there was no major conflict among the three parties, they often fought secretly. Zhongzhou State was the most powerful overlord in the world today, the center of the Dark World, but also a rare pure land in the Dark World. Under the deterrence of Zhongzhou State, the whole of East Asia was peaceful. Gaoshan State's position was ambiguous, and it wavered between the Western powers and Zhongzhou State. Although East Island was powerful, most of its forces had been guarding against the invasion of Zhongzhou State. The peaceful situation had always been under the control of Zhongzhou State. For the world's major dark forces, this was not what they wanted to see, because it meant too many interests and scruples. The dark forces of Zhongzhou State were the most aggressive in the world. Among them, the Wang family of Beihai was the most powerful, followed by Sai City and then Kunlun City. This was not only because the Wang family of Beihai had Zhongzhou State's Sword Emperor Wang Tianzong, who was known as the #1 expert in the Dark World. More importantly, all the forces in Zhongzhou State had an extremely stable rear. This was the most unique phenomenon in the Dark World. The Heroes Club dominated America, but there was the Jiang family in South America and Fantasy World in North America. The three forces entangled with each other while facing other forces. Europe could be said to be the most lively place in the Dark World now. The remnants of Night Spirit, Samsara Palace, Dark Knights, Knights Templars, the Vatican, and various consortiums were entangled with each other. There were many conflicts that even the parties involved couldn't tell how they happened. The Polar Ground Alliance dominated Snow Country in Eastern Europe, but too many historical reasons doomed the Polar Ground Alliance to face a lot of troubles. Political problems and racial problems made the development of the Polar Ground Alliance extremely bumpy. Moreover, the Dark World of Northern Europe was so chaotic every day that people were stunned. The Polar Ground Alliance did not have the opportunity to get out of it. Only Zhongzhou State. Within the territory of the most powerful country in the world, there were only their own people. Although other superpowers were stationed in Zhongzhou State, they didn't amount to much at all. When they were expanding, an extremely stable rear became the most unscrupulous reason for them to act. However, other superpowers didn't dare to attack with all their strength because of the restlessness in their backyards. Almost every superpower in the Dark World had felt this kind of grievance, including Samsara Palace. Behind this kind of grievance often meant concessions and compromises, which meant absolute benefits, power, wealth, or resources. In short, they were what the superpowers in the Dark World pursued. In the long run, as their compromises and concessions increased, Zhongzhou state would be powerful in all aspects to the point of suffocation. How could the giants in the dark world be willing to accept this? To invade Zhongzhou state, at least the Wang family of Beihai must be stopped. The footsteps of Kunlun city must be stopped in East Asia. This was everyone's bottom line. So for many years, as long as there was a chance, the superpowers would always focus on East Asia. While the superpowers were enemies with each other, they didn't mind cooperating occasionally when facing Zhongzhou state. They appeased Gaoshan country, drew East Island to its side, flirted with some important figures in South Asia, and even directly invaded Zhongzhou state. All these were to limit the power of Zhongzhou state in the dark world. 20 years ago the Heroes Club went east. 15 years ago Night Spirit invaded. 10 years ago the Jiang family of South America entered Zhongzhou state and quickly retreated. They took actions again and again, big and small, but every time they failed. As time went by, after Samsara and Zhongzhou state had a cooperative relationship, the superpowers in the dark world gradually quieted down. They all thought they had missed the best opportunity, but they didn't expect that Zhongzhou state would use a final battle to directly target East Island when it attracted all the attention in the dark world. East Island was in a precarious situation. Its economy and special warfare system could be said to be miserable now. But the superpowers in the dark world suddenly found that when East Island was miserable, Zhongzhou state also gave them a huge opportunity. It was an unprecedented opportunity, and also an unprecedented crisis. This was the situation that the superpowers didn't want to see the most, but it was also the opportunity they had been waiting for a long time. Similarly, this was also the reason why several people from various dark superpowers gathered in a shabby house at this time. With East Island as the border, we cooperate outside the border and fight inside the border. How about that? Ben, who was wrapped in a black robe and looked like a skeleton, ignored the voices around him. He looked at the screen quietly, and after a long silence, he suddenly opened his mouth. He turned around. In the dark environment, his face was blurred, but his eyes were extremely bright, full of mysteriousness and treachery. We've been waiting for this day for a long time, haven't we? As the first vice president of the Heroes Club, Ben's strength was needless to say. He was definitely a figure who could be ranked among the superiors of the half-step invincible realm. But his fame didn't come from his strength, but from his insidiousness and cunningness. Ben's code name in the dark world was Ghost Fox, and he was good at deception, disguise, concealment, assassination, and escape. In the dark world, few legends about Ben were about his strength. He always appeared as the think tank of the Heroes Club and played the role of a schemer. This time, from the final battle of Zhongzhou State to the Battle of Changdao, the Heroes Club didn't send anyone to the scene, but it could be said that the Heroes Club was the first superpower to enter East Island. It was also he who made an appointment with these people here today. This might not prove anything, but it was enough to show that Ben's sense of smell in the general trend was extremely sharp. I agree with what Crow said. In the dark, a deep voice rang out. I reserve my opinion. I'm not as smart as you, and I can only see what's in front of me. The current situation is that East Island has already used this area as a battlefield. As for the cooperation outside the border, I don't care, but I'll report it to my superior. In the shadow, a burly bald man walked forward and said in a cold tone. So what do you mean, King Bear? Ben's tone didn't change at all, and he asked in a low voice. The order I received is to attack Samsara Palace and build a branch of the Polar Ground Alliance in East Island. King Bear's body moved agitatedly in the hall. In the shadow he was like a grumpy monster. The attack on Zhongzhou State has nothing to do with the order I received, so... No, Mr. Bear King, I have to tell you that our cooperation doesn't conflict with the order you received. Ben smiled. King Bear of the Polar Ground Alliance could be said to be one of the most famous superiors of strength in the dark world. He had the Thunder Vein, and it had grown several times with the progress of martial arts. His power was so strong that it was comparable to that of the ordinary superiors of the invincible realm. But King Bear was a straightforward person. To put it bluntly, just like what he said, he wasn't very smart. So in the Polar Ground Alliance, although he had a high position and power, every time he took action he would be followed by a top advisor. Today King Bear came alone, but the advisor was nowhere to be seen, which was a bit strange. I can't guess what His Highness the Alliance leader is thinking, but I think in any case His Highness will not let go of the opportunity to weaken Zhongzhou State. Attacking Samsara Palace and even building the headquarters of the Polar Ground Alliance in East Island are all intended to contain Zhongzhou State. Ben's skeleton-like skinny body floated slowly in the hall, and his tone became more and more relaxed. I know you and Crow have doubts about this battlefield, but in my opinion, this battlefield is the most suitable place for us to play. From my plan, what East Island has done is simply perfect. Perfect? Crow sneered in a hoarse voice. He was the leader of Fantasy World in East Island this time. Although his status was not as high as Ben's in the Heroes Club, it was not much different, so he spoke without scruples. Sorry, I don't see what's perfect about it. I only see the stupidity of East Island. I admit that this is their home field, and we came to Changdao to show our respect to them. But these stupid guys actually want to plan the battlefield? Who do they think they are? The Battle of Changdao is right in front of us. When and where it will happen, can East Island completely control it? Can you fly? Ben suddenly asked. What? Crow subconsciously froze for a second. Yes, I can fly. But how far can you fly? This is East Island's home field, and it's not difficult for East Island to roughly locate us. Why do you think they can't plan the battlefield for us? Ben's tone was cold. Didn't you watch the news? The spokesman of East Island military said it was a military anti-terrorism drill. Crow, don't you understand? Military anti-terrorism drill? Crow muttered to himself, and his face suddenly changed. When there was a military drill, there would naturally be an army. This was common sense that everyone knew. Maybe you should go outside and have a look? Ben squinted his eyes and said with a smile. Crow's face was gloomy. His figure flashed, and he already appeared by the window. They were now in an old city area that was about to be demolished just in the suburbs. When East Island planned the battlefield, they directly included this area. According to the satellite map, this old city area was just on the edge of the battlefield. At this moment, in Crow's sight, a large number of ordnance had been transported here, and soldiers in East Island military uniforms were coming slowly from afar. Armored vehicles could be seen everywhere, and it looked like they had completely surrounded this place. Crow's face was gloomy and cold, and his whole body was filled with undisguised killing intent. 10 years ago his throat was injured and he was almost cut with a sword. And the initiator was the current number 1 superior of East Island, Tianhai Wuji, who was trapped in Zhongzhou State. Therefore Crow didn't like East Islanders at all. Looking at the approaching army, his eyes gradually became crazy with crazy killing intent. East Island dares to send troops to the conflict in the Dark World? Crow's smile was cruel and gloomy. Are they crazy? They're just practicing and they won't join the war blatantly. Ben shook his head. None of the superpowers that could become giants in the Dark World were simple. Behind every superpower there were more or less political factors. In Zhongzhou State, the Wang family of Beihai was the head of the Southeast Group. Kunlun City was the highest special warfare agency in Zhongzhou State. Sai City could also dominate Mount Taibai in the northeast. The Polar Ground Alliance was in Snow Country, and its involvement with the energy oligarchs and even the military and government of Snow Country would only be more complicated. Fantasy World was deeply rooted in North America, and it was also supported by a strong power. In this case, if they used the army to solve the conflict in the Dark World, it was tantamount to suicide for East Island, which was not strong in military power. Once such a thing became a fact, it would be a war and there would be no room for negotiation. So it was basically impossible for these soldiers to join the war. But if they didn't join the war, they could block the battlefield. In the territory of East Island, if East Island wanted to fight, everyone could see it. No matter who it was, they had to obey the will of East Island. This was the home advantage of a country. Look, what a spectacular scene. Ben came to Crow and said with a smile, "It fits perfectly with my plan. Everyone, I think we can talk about my plan now. The blockade plan." Blockade? Crow twitched the corner of his mouth. In the dim light in the hall, his expression was not obvious, but the mockery in his tone was obvious. "Ben, is your plan to block us all?" "You can say that." Ben said blandly, "At least on this battlefield we can't get out, but neither can the people of Zhongzhou State." Crow and King Bear froze at the same time. The power of Zhongzhou State is too scattered and they are too confident. East Island, Northern Europe, North America and their own base camp, they are indeed powerful, but they can't be so extravagant. If the people of East Island trap the elites of Zhongzhou State here. If Knights Templars and Fantasy World start to fight back against the power of the Snowdance Corps in North America and Northern Europe, what will happen to Zhongzhou State? Ben asked with a smile. "They will definitely support us," King Bear said without hesitation. This was a truth that everyone understood. As a newly established super elite legion in Zhongzhou State, the Snowdance Corps' internal lineup was completely stunning. According to the news they received, Zhongzhou State had 3 young heavenly sons, 2 invincible realm experts, a large number of young geniuses, and the backbone of the special service generation, including a super assassin like Tribulation. This force could almost be said to be the most reliable force of Zhongzhou State. Using them to deal with East Island showed how determined Zhongzhou State was this time. But no matter how determined Zhongzhou State was, it was impossible for Zhongzhou State to watch them fall into a desperate situation. Once the elites of Zhongzhou State were trapped in East Island, and Fantasy World and Knights Templars exchanged battlefields to attack Situt Sanyue and Gu Qianchuan, Zhongzhou State would definitely support them without any hesitation. Oh, support. Ben nodded. But what if they have a reason not to support us? What do you mean? Crow's tone was cold, but his eyes gradually lit up. For example here. Ben straightened his body and switched the screen. A map of Zhongzhou State appeared on the screen, with vast mountains and rivers and beautiful mountains and rivers. Ben pointed at the border and said indifferently, between the Snowdance Corps and the Border Praetorian Corps, which one is more important to Zhongzhou State? The Border Control Corps. Crow's and King Bear's faces changed at the same time. We are enemies of each other, yes. But enemies also pursue common interests. On the matter of Zhongzhou State, our position is the same. So, maybe we can really cooperate for once. Zhongzhou State and Samsara dare to disperse their forces, but don't we dare to disperse our forces? Crow's eyes were shining and hesitant. He seemed to be hesitating and afraid. This is the best chance and maybe the last chance. After the fall of the Li family in Zhongzhou State, although Gu Xingyun became the war god of Zhongzhou State, he has been busy consolidating his position for many years. In the early stage he had to face the suspicion of others in Zhongzhou State. In the middle stage, Sword Emperor Wang Tianzong killed Heavenly Spirit with one shot and stole too much of his limelight. After a few years of peace, Samsara appeared again. Kunlun City seemed to be prosperous, but in fact, it has not been comfortable these years. Otherwise, why would Gu Xingyun make so many deals with us? But this time is different. Gu Xingyun has almost consolidated his position. This time, Zhongzhou State conspires against East Island. Samsara is the leader, but Gu Xingyun is the promoter. Obviously, Gu Xingyun needs a huge victory to completely walk on the altar. If Zhongzhou State wins this time, Zhongzhou State will not only open a gap in East Island, but also let none of us have a good time in the future. Now we have such a good chance to give Zhongzhou State a fatal blow. I don't understand. Why are you hesitating? Ben took a deep breath, took out a cigarette and lit it. He said indifferently, as long as the 5 of us work together, no matter what Zhongzhou State does, it can't win. There was no doubt about that. No one would doubt this. Once they joined forces to invade Zhongzhou State again, Zhongzhou State was bound to be in a difficult situation. Support the Border Control Corps? The Snowdance Corps was about to give up. Support the Snowdance Corps. Once the Border Control Corps was forced, it was not just a matter of losing face because the National Gate was invaded. The Border Control Corps was the most elite combat corps of Zhongzhou State. Zhongzhou State could not afford to lose it either. Now the Snowdance Corps was acting in North America, Northern Europe, and East Island. Although they all had a tacit understanding with Zhongzhou State, as long as Zhongzhou State was strangled, those outside Zhongzhou State could not go back, and those inside Zhongzhou State could not come out. This was the real blockade. But, Wang Tianzong, Crow opened his mouth and spat out a name. The pressure that this name brought was just too great, causing Crow's tone to become sluggish and sluggish. The top expert on the divine list. The Sword Emperor of Zhongzhou State held the first murderous weapon in the Dark World, Human Emperor. This was not a name at all. It was a mountain that pressed on everyone's heart. Zhongzhou State conspired against East Island in the general trend. But all the superpowers conspired against Zhongzhou State in the general trend. But Wang Tianzong, how to deal with it? If Wang Tianzong takes action, someone will stop him. A peaceful voice suddenly sounded in the corner of the hall. Holy Light, the deputy commander of Knights Templars. Crow couldn't speak for a while. Thinking of the behemoth behind Knights Templars, which had a small territory but boundless faith, Crow seemed to understand something vaguely. We can't give up on East Island either. Holy Light said with firm and persistent eyes, we are still maintaining a cooperative relationship with East Island, and we have even paid a lot, of course. Ben said with a smile, we will all stay in East Island. As for who will go to Zhongzhou State, it's the business of His Highnesses behind us. Holy Light nodded. His white robe seemed out of place in the dark hall, filled with a kind of holy radiance. All the superpowers in the dark world were constantly fighting for interest. But Knights Templars had always been spreading faith in fierce means. The road ahead of Knights Templars was the Holy War. It would never end. Holy Light suddenly frowned and said thoughtfully, "And if this thing succeeds, I want a person." Okay. Crow said first, "If this thing succeeds, you have contributed the most, and Fantasy World will have no problem with who you want. Our Jiang family has no problem with that. But we can give him to you except Li Tianlan. This guy is related to the destiny of our Jiang family for hundreds of years. If Knights Templars want him, then I have to say sorry." In the dark hall, there seemed to be a void passing through the eaves and spreading in the room. A vague illusory shadow walked into the room and said with a smile, "Sorry I'm late." "Evil?" The crow subconsciously raised its voice. "We have met." In the hall, the only invincible realm killer in the dark world seemed to chuckle. "But I didn't know you well enough before. To show my sincerity, I would like to introduce myself again. Jiang Chenhua of the Jiang family of South America, code name Evil. Fantasy World. Heroes Club. Polar Ground Alliance. Knights Templars. Jiang family of South America. 5 families gathered." The living room was strangely quiet for a moment. Then Holy Light broke the silence again. "Sorry," he said softly but firmly, "what we want is also Li Tianlan." Jiang Chenhua said in a playful tone, "Is this an order from your chaotic highness?" Holy Light narrowed his eyes slightly and looked straight at the illusory shadow in front of him. He said calmly, "No. It's His Majesty's prophecy." Everyone's face changed. Evil's expression instantly became extremely ugly. His Majesty. In the dark world, this was a very special word. And there were only 2 people who deserved this word and could make them sincerely awe. One was the Sword Emperor of Zhongzhou State, Wang Tianzong. In the misty darkness of the Wang family of Beihai, the Sword Emperor's sword was enough to make people feel desperate. And the other one? He was not in the dark world, nor was he an invincible realm expert. He controlled the most extreme and crazy dark power in the dark world, but he had been walking in the brightest light and moving forward in the praise of people. From the light to a brighter light. Chapter 202. The night was as cool as water, and the moon was bright and the stars were sparse. Ninghu had the cleanest sky and coast in the whole East Island. Looking from a distance at night, the sky and the sea were closely connected, with a kind of pure and awe-inspiring power. Whether it was day or night, Wuxia Mountain in the northeast of Ninghu was the best place to view the scenery. There was a cliff on the edge of Wuxia Mountain near the sea, which was nearly 1,000 meters above sea level. It was the highest place near Ninghu city. The cliff was not big, but it was magnificent, especially at night. Standing on the cliff, listening to the sound of waves, the endless pure sea in front of them, and the continuous bright lights of Ninghu behind them, it was an indescribable feeling. It seemed that the prosperity of the city and the profoundness of the sea were all under their feet, which made people feel that everything in Ninghu was under their control. Qin Weibai didn't remember how long she had been standing here. From sunset to nightfall, the sky became purer and the moon became brighter. Time kept moving forward, and only the cliff under their feet remained unchanged. Qin Weibai was also motionless. She just stood there quietly with her back to the bright lights behind her, looking at the deep sea in front of her. She seemed to be meditating but also seemed to be observing something. The sea breeze in the middle of the night blew over with a cold chill. Qin Weibai's white retro dress and black hair danced with the wind at the same time. In the night wind, her face had a kind of almost transparent paleness, but her eyes, which were always focused, were as bright as stars, soft and persistent. The sea breeze blew over the cliff, sprinkling on Wuxia Mountain with a delicate fragrance. Qin Weibai, who had been silent for a long time, finally opened her mouth and said softly, "What do you feel?" Behind her, 2 black shadows stood quietly, as if they had been completely integrated into the night. The 2 were of similar height and their clothes were exactly the same. They both wore black cloaks and the wide brims of the hats completely covered their faces. When they lowered their heads, their expressions were completely immersed in the darkness, and no one could see any outline. Nothing. The 2 figures in the cloaks seemed to look at each other, and then shook their heads with great tacit understanding. When the 2 of them stood together, they looked like a mirror image under the curtain of the night. However, there were some subtle differences between them. The difference was in the decoration and temperament. The figure in the black cloak on the left seemed to be straighter, carrying a long sword. Although he didn't move, there seemed to be endless sword energy hovering around him. The sword energy moved with the wind and kept gathering in the slight whistling sound, vaguely with a kind of sharpness and fierceness that went straight to the ninth heaven. In comparison, the figure under the black cloak on the right was much more peaceful. He just stood there casually without any sharp or domineering aura. There was only a kind of steady and somewhat frightening calmness and indifference, like the vast ocean under a cliff. When the wind was calm and the waves were calm, it gave off an almost unfathomable feeling of profoundness and profoundness. Say, military counselor. Since the appearance of the Samsara Palace in the Dark World, they had been the two most mysterious supermasters in the Samsara. No one knew their true identities, but in the repeated confrontations in the Dark World, all the dark superpowers had felt their power. As the was. When the mysterious palace was silent, the as palace would king. Saint and military counselor were the force and wisdom of the Samsara Palace. They always appeared at the most opportune time and disappeared at the most improbable time. For several years, except for the master of Samsara Palace, no one knew their identity and no one could capture their traces. Like now. When the cooperation between the Samsara and Zhongzhou state was at the most critical stage, no one thought that Qin Weibai, the key figure, would show up in East Island. She went from Dongdu to Changdao and finally to Ninghu. Also, no one thought that the two strongest supermasters of the Samsara, who were supposed to be preparing for the war in Changdao, had also avoided the surveillance of East Island and secretly came to Ninghu. Didn't you feel it? Qin Weibai murmured to herself. In the cool air formed by the night wind and the waves, her black hair and white clothes fluttered in the wind. Qin Weibai didn't look embarrassed at all. Instead, she stood up proudly with her tall and slender body. Facing the sea. Facing the bright moon. Facing the starry sky. The scene this time was truly as beautiful as a painting with an unparalleled celestial bearing. I felt danger. Qin Weibai breathed softly and said calmly. Danger? The sword intent around Saint suddenly froze. To be exact, it's the forbearance and ambition of an ambitious man for many years. Qin Weibai smiled. The moonlight shone softly, and her whole body seemed to emit a hazy and dreamy light. Looking at the sea in front of her, her tone was soft, but with a hint of indifference. This place is very special. It's so special that I've been looking for it for a long time. Ambitious man? Military counselor repeated and then smiled softly. Standing behind Qin Weibai, both military counselor and Saint were much more natural than the other supermasters. At least they weren't as cautious as the other supermasters. Even their tone was natural, as if they were chatting. In your eyes, this is not an evaluation that anyone can afford. In the Dark World, although Qin Weibai didn't have the title of a giant, she exercised the power of a giant. Standing at her current height, there were only a few people in the Dark World who could be evaluated as ambitious men by her. It's not a matter of whether I can afford it or not. Qin Weibai's tone was complicated, with mockery, coldness, and a little absent-mindedness. He is an ambitious man. He doesn't need anyone's evaluation. This place is his foundation and his hope. Unfortunately. She paused. At this moment, Qin Weibai's white dress fluttered. She turned her back to Saint and military counselor, so no one could see her expression clearly. But there seemed to be a sense of sadness spreading on the cliff. Unfortunately, I still found him. Saint and military counselor looked at each other again. After a short silence, Saint tentatively said, Then tonight we come here, to wait for someone and kill someone. Qin Weibai's answer was simple. Saint and military counselor also fell silent and didn't ask more. The superpowers in the Dark World had their own unique labels. The Wang family of Beihai was powerful, the Jiang family of South America was low-key, the Knights Templars were fanatical, the Dark Knights were extreme, the Polar Ground Alliance was insidious, and so on, and the label of Samsara was mysterious. The way Samsara operated, the location of their headquarters, and the specific strength of the master of Samsara Palace were all unknown to the Dark World. In people's minds, as the top two supermasters in Samsara, the famous Saint and military counselor, who almost never showed up, should have the status and power second only to the master of Samsara Palace and Qin Weibai. But the actual situation was the opposite. Samsara and Saint did have a high status, but they were not responsible for anything in Samsara Palace. Could be anything. In terms of actual power, any supermaster in Samsara who was below Saint and military counselor had more power than the two of them. Saint and military counselor, most of the time, played the perfect executors when Samsara needed them. They just did things regardless of the reason. When they were not needed, they were like two shadows inside Samsara Palace, almost without any trace of their existence. Especially after Qin Weibai appeared, the two of them carried out this style of only doing things to the extreme. From Changdao they secretly escorted Qin Weibai to Ninghu. Until now, Saint and military counselor didn't know what Qin Weibai was going to do, and they didn't need to know. Wait for someone, kill someone. That was enough, and they didn't need to ask more. Time passed in silence. After midnight, the area around the cliff became quieter and quieter. Only the sound of wind and waves swept past people's ears. A fishing village less than 3 kilometers below the cliff was completely silent. After the lights went out, all the areas of Wuxia Mountain became completely dark and silent. Military counselor yawned out of boredom and suddenly said, "What will you say after this is over?" "Go back home. There are a lot of things in the country. Just thinking about it gives me a headache." Saint was surrounded by sword energy and his momentum was amazing. But his voice turned from hoarse to clear, as if he was a little helpless. Military counselor's voice also contained a hint of a smile. He nodded and said, "You've been doing a lot lately. You've been doing a lot more than me, haven't you?" "I'm not doing a lot. Things that were already in the bag could be left to the children to practice. But recently I found that there's one more expert in Huading. You can't imagine who he is. He's a person that we all paid attention to but ignored. If he hadn't gone to Jinling as soon as he arrived in Huading, maybe I wouldn't have found him. What is hiding? Now I've seen it. An expert? At least not much worse than you and me. But this person has always been restless. Now that he's backed by a big tree, it seems that he still won't stop. If I'm right, there will be a 3-surnamed slave in modern society." In military counselor's playful voice, Saint's body under the cloak slightly tightened. The words 3-surnamed slave made him immediately think of who the so-called expert was. "It's him? Did I see it right?" That's why people say that a real person doesn't show his face. In the following time, I plan to study this person carefully. But his appearance in Huading is not a bad thing for us, at least for now. Military counselor took out a cigarette and lit it. Faint smoke blew out from the cloak. He looked at Qin Weibai, who was motionless in front of him, and suddenly said with a smile, "Boss, you don't seem to be surprised by this news at all? There is no 3-surnamed slave. All these years he has only one position and it has never changed." Qin Weibai said faintly, "A person who can endure for many years even if his own daughter was killed, his loyalty and sacrifice are worthy of respect. But I just don't know from his standpoint whose slave is he." In the darkness, military counselor shrugged and seemed to smile bitterly. Samsara's almost all-pervasive intelligence system was definitely enough to make anyone feel afraid. The secret pawns of some superpowers and the truth of the things that happened many years ago were completely exposed in the search of Samsara's intelligence system. There were no secrets at all. And such a strict intelligence system had always been in the control of Qin Weibai. Military counselor thought that the news he said was shocking enough, but he didn't expect that the boss had already known the information and even knew it in more detail than him. Military counselor smiled helplessly and subconsciously glanced at Qin Weibai. Under the bright pale moonlight, this amazing woman who made several giants in the dark world fall head over heels for him only showed him the back of a peerless beauty. She faced the sea but turned her back to the whole world. In military counselor's impression, the boss a few years ago had always been quiet, quiet and beautiful, quiet like a statue of a god carved out of ice that had been frozen for thousands of years. Every move of his had been unattainable, perfect and noble, and could only be admired by others. A few months ago the boss was happy. He could clearly feel the look in the boss's eyes at that time. It was a touch of satisfaction, but with unforgettable gentleness. But now military counselor could only feel her loneliness. The loneliness that went deep into the bone and the soul. Military counselor opened his mouth and wanted to say something, but he didn't know why he couldn't say a word. Finally, he closed his mouth and kept silent. A soft phone ring sounded in the night. Qin Weibai, who had stood motionless for a long time, took out her mobile phone and answered it, but she didn't speak. On the phone, Duke's calm and steady voice sounded. "Boss, Daybreak has just responded to my request on behalf of His Highness." "What did he say?" As her white dress and hair fluttered in the wind, Qin Weibai's delicate body, which no one dared to profane, suddenly tightened. "Daybreak told me that they can get what we want but not much and it takes time," Duke said in a low voice. There was silence. There was a dead silence on the cliff in an instant. Qin Weibai held the phone tightly in her hand, and her body began to tremble slightly in the silence. The trembling became more and more obvious, but her tone seemed to be suppressing the storm and tide in the deep sea. He said they can get it? Qin Weibai asked calmly. Even through the phone, Duke still seemed to feel a great danger coming. His voice was lower and he said carefully, Daybreak said so. Good. Qin Weibai nodded. After a full minute of silence she said again, good. What a goodly. In the night wind, her somewhat sharp voice paused and then became absolutely calm again. I got it, she said and then hung up the phone. Saint and military counselor were silent. Military counselor took a slight step back. Around him, the airflow within a radius of several meters suddenly twisted violently. The sword energy around Saint swirled wildly like a storm. The two of them didn't know what Qin Weibai's phone call meant, but they knew that the last time their boss spoke in this tone was less than 24 hours ago. The Night Spirit organization was destroyed. Saint and military counselor entered the fighting state almost immediately. At this moment, the two super masters, no matter who they were facing, only had the fighting desire left. This time, our Samsara cooperates with the mysterious ally of East Island. Do you know what I want? Qin Weibai took a deep breath and suddenly asked. You want them to guarantee Li Tianlan's safety? Military counselor said slowly. Yes. I paid a lot just to let them protect Tianlan's safety. But other than that, I also want some other things that are very rare but very difficult to find. Qin Weibai's tone was crisp and cold. Her pleasant voice was full of a strong and suffocating murderous aura. I want the coldest poison and the hottest poison. Have you heard of these two things? You haven't. But why do they know what they are? And they can take them out? Ah. Clap. Qin Weibai threw the phone in her hand onto the cliff. Her delicate and perfect face was bathed in the moonlight, but there was undisguised coldness and anger in her tone. What is right and wrong? What is grievance? What is friendship? Her tone was getting louder and louder and her rising voice echoed on the whole cliff. It was so majestic that it could break gold and crack stones. Military counselor and Saint didn't say a word. As far as they could remember, Qin Weibai had never behaved like this before. This seemed to be the first time that she did not hide her anger and indifference at all. Her venting sounded like she was interrogating them, but also with strong resentment. Saint. Qin Weibai suddenly said in a heavy tone, I want to kill someone. My pleasure. Saint took a step forward and said in a neither humble nor arrogant tone, Who do you want to kill, boss? The real young heavenly son. Do you dare to kill him? Qin Weibai bent down, picked up the phone on the ground and turned on the screen. On the screen, the photo of her and Li Tianlan snuggling together immediately came into view. Qin Weibai's cold, majestic and bright eyes softened quietly. She carefully wiped the dust off the screen, and the killing intent in her tone grew stronger and stronger. The saint remained calm and said, It's my pleasure. Military counselor? Qin Weibai called out without turning her head. Military counselor smiled slightly. His tone was very implicit, but the content was straightforward and explicit. In my heart, Tianlan is the only young heavenly son. Except for Tianlan, there are no other young masters that I can't kill. This flattery was quite shameless, but it was extremely effective. Qin Weibai's anger began to subside quickly, and even her tone became much softer. Tianlan, she murmured softly, shook her head and said, If he doesn't die tonight, he may become Tianlan's strongest opponent in the future, the only one. Even Saint and military counselor were a little moved by such an evaluation. Li Tianlan's current potential had long been recognized. Not to mention his current realm, just in terms of potential, no one thought that he would be any worse than Wang Xingxiao and Gu Hanshan. When such a person grew up, he only needed to enter the thunder-shocking realm to make the masters of the half-step invincible realm feel tricky. Li Tianlan's strongest opponent in the future? The only one? Saint, who didn't speak much but would carefully remember every word of Qin Weibai, suddenly said, Because of talent? As expected, Qin Weibai shook her head but didn't say much. Saint glanced at her thoughtfully. It's my honor to help the man you love the most. Military counselor flattered like a tide, but his voice was implicit and sincere. The man you love the most? Qin Weibai asked back. Military counselor's expression froze. He simply hid his face in the cloak and others couldn't see it. He kept smiling and said, Boss, you don't love him? I love him. Qin Weibai nodded and said softly, It's just, do I deserve it? Do I deserve it? She asked a question, but it wasn't about military counselor or saint. It was more like she was interrogating her soul in a very serious manner. Do I deserve it? She stood silently at the edge of the cliff, proudly straightening her body. At that moment, the military counselor could clearly feel that under the boss's beautiful appearance, all the energy, chi, and spirit had been sucked out in an instant. Her entire person was filled with a kind of emptiness and despair. Boss. Saint and military counselor spoke at the same time. I'm fine. Qin Weibai suddenly came back to her senses, and she became cold and piercingly cold again. Beside the cliff, the beauty looked up at the moon. The pure blue night sky was bright, and the sparse stars were shimmering. A bright, almost dazzling star abruptly fell from the extreme end of the sky in an exaggerated arc. The star tore up the moonlight and fell into the deep sea. The general star fell and the heavenly sun should die. Qin Weibai's beautiful face gradually bloomed with a smile that could almost topple a country. It's hard to defy destiny. It seems that tonight is a lucky night. Boss, do you also believe in destiny? Saint asked with a gentle laugh. If I didn't believe in destiny, how could I live until now? Qin Weibai's eyes were bright and lonely. She looked down. After midnight, when dawn was approaching, two vague figures finally appeared in the farthest distance of her sight. The two figures were extremely fast and their destination was very clear. They climbed Wuxia Mountain and went straight to the cliff. The figures were getting closer and closer. The silhouettes of a man and a woman gradually came into view. Saint and military counselor's eyes suddenly focused. Until this moment they didn't know who the boss was waiting for. When military counselor and Saint secretly sneaked into Ninghu, no one noticed that a famous superior of the Wang family of Beihai's camp was also missing. Black Pupil from the Wang family of Beihai. And the one who appeared with Black Pupil was a sensitive figure like Qin Weibai who shouldn't have appeared in East Island. He shouldn't have appeared, and he shouldn't have met the current Qin Weibai in the current situation. The man and the woman moved forward quickly. Black Pupil followed them silently. The young man in front of her strode forward as if he were taking a stroll in a courtyard. The Wang family of Beihai. Chapter 203. The moonlight covered every corner of Wuxia Mountain. The sea in the middle of the night gently undulated and dense water vapor rose. In the deep night, the water in the mountain was moist and the outside of the mountain was hazy. People on the mountain looked down the mountain. People at the foot of the mountain looked up at the top of the mountain. They were all sceneries. Qin Weibai was motionless. Her calm gaze seemed to pass through the night and fell directly on Wang Xiaoyao and Black Pupil. Black Pupil, who was walking up, instinctively stopped and looked up at the white clothes on the cliff at the top of the mountain. Her black pupils, which could hardly see any white of her eyes, flickered with dim light, mysterious and quiet. Her white clothes and long hair fluttered in the wind. Her flawless and delicate face. Her eyes were as clear as water but cold and bright. All the scenes on the top of the mountain appeared in Black Pupil's sight. Her dark eyes even clearly reflected Qin Weibai's figure. They were like two white dots in his pupils and only two white dots. All the scenes on the cliff disappeared. In a trance, it seemed that only her figure stood quietly, bathed in the moonlight between heaven and earth. She was proud, indifferent, perfect and sharp. Unparalleled in the world. That feeling went far beyond the so-called charm and beauty, but became a shock that people dared not touch and profane. Qin Weibai. Black Pupil subconsciously lowered her head, avoided the gaze on the mountain and asked. Among the many experts of the Wang family of Beihai, Black Pupil was not the strongest, but she was not the worst. But she was definitely one of the people who left Beihai province the least. She had heard of the title of the first beauty in Zhongzhou state, but she had never had the chance to see it. Until now, she really understood that excessive beauty could also make people feel fear and danger. Wang Xiaoyao responded in a low voice and there was a struggle in his eyes. Black Pupil's eyebrows moved, and a dark cloud gathered between her eyebrows, obscure and strong. The intelligence of the Wang family of Beihai still clearly showed that Qin Weibai was still in Zhongzhou state. At this time, she appeared in East Island without anyone knowing, which was a very unusual thing. In other people's cognition, Wang Xiaoyao, who was also in Zhongzhou state, secretly sneaked into East Island at this time and contacted Qin Weibai late at night, which suddenly made this matter more unusual. Qrom sighed softly. She wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. In the end she didn't say anything. When Firmament and the Enchantress were both in East Island, Wang Xiaoyao, who came to Changdao secretly, only brought her here, which was enough to explain some problems. This night was destined to be unusual. Some things that should have happened would inevitably be foreshadowed in the general trend, and no one would be able to stop them. Ahead Wang Xiaoyao kept walking. Without the slightest hesitation, Curome followed. She couldn't stop because the person in front of her was still going up. She did not know how far the man in front of her would go, but as long as she was still here, she would follow him. Even if she was alone. Wang Xiaoyao walked through the path covered with stones and rushed to the cliff with the shortest route in the shortest time. His forehead was already sweating. The cliff was extremely high. Compared to the surrounding Wuxia mountain, it was unique. The whistling night wind blew past the top of the cliff. His sweat quickly became cold, but the coldness did not disappear. Instead, it seeped into his skin and continued to permeate his body. In the late summer night, in the cold wind by the sea, Wang Xiaoyao felt like falling into the ice field, and his whole body was extremely cold. The corner of his mouth moved. Looking at Qin Weibai in front of him, his eyes were complicated and he said softly, "There are too many people here, so I'm late." The meaning of this sentence was extraordinary. At least it meant that Wang Xiaoyao wanted to avoid more than some monitoring forces of East Island. It was quiet on the cliff. Military counselor and Saint moved their bodies quietly and stood on the left and right sides behind Qin Weibai. In the whistling wind, their bodies seemed to gradually twist and eventually became blurred, like two shadows standing behind Qin Weibai. Qin Weibai's mood seemed to be still agitated. Looking at the sparkling sea under the moonlight, she was silent for 5 or 6 minutes before she turned around and said calmly, "If you come a little later, we don't have to talk about our cooperation." Cold, straightforward, and direct. Black Pupil, who was standing behind Wang Xiaoyao, raised her eyebrows. Her dark pupils looked even more terrifying in the slightly strange environment. She forced herself to endure the sudden anger in her heart, took a deep breath and remained silent. Obviously, there was no room for her to speak in this meeting tonight. Very few people knew about this meeting tonight, and even fewer people could understand the specific meaning of this meeting. Wang Xiaoyao came to see Qin Weibai, which was equivalent to directly contacting the will of Samsara Palace. But Samsara Palace directly contacting Wang Xiaoyao. And only Wang Xiaoyao. Cooperation. Wang Xiaoyao didn't care about the impoliteness in Qin Weibai's tone. His face was a little pale, with obvious hesitation and struggle, and he muttered to himself. He smiled bitterly and said, "Little Bai, do you know that I would rather not have such a cooperation?" "I'm sorry." Qin Weibai was silent for a while, reached out to tidy up her hair that was blown by the wind and said blandly, "I don't know." Her tone was calm, but there was no emotion in it. Between the lines, there was a sense of alienation that kept people thousands of miles away. This was an attitude that was enough to make any man feel frustrated and even desperate. But it was also an attitude that Wang Xiaoyao was used to. As the younger brother of the Sword Emperor of Zhongzhou State, Wang Xiaoyao's noble identity was self-evident. With his identity, he had pursued a woman for several years, but there was no scandal. This could fully explain how indifferent the woman behind this obsessive unrequited love was. "Yeah, you don't know," Wang Xiaoyao muttered to himself, and his eyes became more and more gloomy. If he hadn't really fallen in love with the woman in front of him, how wonderful would the meeting tonight be? The word love turned all the plans into contradictions and entanglements. It made him want to retreat when he could only move forward. Was it all worth it? Wang Xiaoyao was in a trance. Qin Weibai's clear voice continued to ring, "I don't need to know. But I can roughly understand." "You don't understand." Wang Xiaoyao shook his head subconsciously. For hundreds of years, the Wang family of Beihai has been the greatest family in the dark world. "Do you know why?" Qin Weibai suddenly asked. As soon as these words came out, not only Wang Xiaoyao but also Black Pupil, and even Saint and military counselor were obviously stunned. "Of course I know." In an instant, the contradiction in Wang Xiaoyao's eyes disappeared. He stared at Qin Weibai in front of him, opened his mouth but could not continue to speak. "I also know." Qin Weibai's expression was still indifferent, faintly perfect, but the brilliance in her eyes was getting brighter. "So, I still understand. This has something to do with our cooperation, but it also has nothing to do with it, right?" Wang Xiaoyao was silent. "How are the preparations going?" Qin Weibai turned around again, but her eyes were no longer looking at the sea. Instead, she stood at the highest point, quietly observing the small village shrouded in moonlight a few kilometers away. "I have got the half-style shadow formula from Li Tianlan." Wang Xiaoyao shook his head absent-mindedly. "It will take some time. Your plan needs time and opportunity. Tianlan may be the opportunity you have always wanted." Qin Weibai nodded and said. Wang Xiaoyao clenched his fists, feeling a little uneasy and irritated. With a wry smile, he took out a cigarette and lit it. he took a deep breath and said, "What do you need me to do?" Tonight's meeting was actually simple but not simple. He cooperated with Samsara, so he needed Qin Weibai's promise, and Qin Weibai needed his sincerity. It could be regarded as taking what they needed. But she asked him to meet here. Wang Xiaoyao looked around. The sea, the beach, the cliff, the lights in the distance, he couldn't figure out how to express his sincerity here. This kind of sincerity, which was similar to a pledge of allegiance, could not be shown by doing something casually when standing at the height of him and Samsara. "I want you to help me kill a young man." Qin Weibai looked at the quiet village in the distance and said seriously, "Okay." Wang Xiaoyao was a little surprised. It seemed too simple to just kill a person. He nodded and said, "I'll let Black Pupil do it." "Kill who? Where?" "What I mean is, I want you to help me kill a young man. Right here." Very calmly, Qin Weibai repeated the sentence again. Wang Xiaoyao's eyes narrowed slightly. Vaguely, he could feel that the sincerity he wanted to express did not seem to be so simple, and the key to this sincerity was the young man Qin Weibai wanted him to kill. "You want me to do it myself?" "Kill who?" Wang Xiaoyao asked. "A real young heavenly son. Black Pupil is no match for him." Qin Weibai said softly without batting an eyelid. The amount of information contained in this seemingly light sentence could be described as stormy waves. No matter how calm Wang Xiaoyao was, he couldn't help but change his face. A young heavenly son that Black Pupil was no match for? How young was he? There seemed to be only a few such characters in the entire dark world, and they were basically the kind of young people who were about 30 years old and not young. As for the younger ones, Wang Xingxiao, who was 23 years old and only a few months away from creating a new record, had now reached the thunder-shocking realm. Wang Xingxiao, who had wind and thunder veins and top-notch inheritance and amazing talent, could defeat most experts at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. But in the face of Black Pupil, who was infinitely close to the half-step invincible realm, he still didn't have much confidence. A young heavenly son that even Black Pupil was no match for? Wang Xingxiao, Li Tianlan, Gu Hanshan. These three names first came to Wang Xiaoyao's mind. It was naturally impossible for Wang Xingxiao. Qin Weibai would not ask him to kill his own nephew unless she was crazy. It was even more impossible for Li Tianlan. Gu Hanshan was definitely no match for Black Pupil. In East Island, Mai Shiranui, the young palace master of Liuhua Palace, was amazing enough, but compared with Black Pupil she was much worse. Crown Prince Ren could no longer be regarded as a young man. As for other forces, they naturally had their own young experts, but most of them were protected. At least in East Island, where the general situation was unclear, the probability of their appearance was very small. In this way, who did Qin Weibai want to kill? And she wanted him to do it himself. Wang Xiaoyao was very clear that at least in the information of the major forces, his combat capability was far inferior to Black Pupil's. Wang Xiaoyao was an expert. In Zhongzhou State he could be as famous as Bai Yuming, which was enough to show his extraordinary talent. But Bai Yuming was now only in the stabilization phase of the thunder-shocking realm, which was nearly 2 small realms lower than Black Pupil. The difference between the two was obvious. But now Qin Weibai's meaning was already very sure that Wang Xiaoyao's strength was still above Black Pupil's. Wang Xiaoyao's eyes flickered. Qin Weibai's short sentence contained at least 3 meanings. She knew that he was hiding his strength. East Island now had an unknown young heavenly son. And behind the young heavenly son, there must be an unknown force. Before he came to East Island, he knew that the situation in East Island was complicated. But only when he really came here could he really understand how complicated this chaotic situation was because of the general trend. Who is he? Where is he? Wang Xiaoyao calmed himself down and asked. He's here. Qin Weibai said blandly, if you come a little later, you may miss it. Who is he? Wang Xiaoyao still insisted on this question. Qin Weibai fell silent, making it clear that she did not intend to tell him anything else. Little Bai, Wang Xiaoyao hesitated for a moment and finally said, what do you want to do? There was something wrong with the two of them meeting here, but the most wrong thing was Qin Weibai. It was really too strange for her to show up here. At least Wang Xiaoyao couldn't figure it out. Both of them had their own secrets. But now it seemed that Qin Weibai had known about his plan, but he knew nothing about Qin Weibai's purpose. This feeling made Wang Xiaoyao instinctively feel a little uneasy. I don't want to do anything big. Qin Weibai said blandly, everything I'm doing now is just to change my fate. Wang Xiaoyao stopped talking. In Qin Weibai's ambiguous answer, he clearly felt the danger and even felt trouble. If everything was related to himself, he would agree without hesitation. He didn't even need any cooperation just because this was Qin Weibai's request. But behind a young heavenly son, there might be too many things, and it might also be related to the entire Wang family of Beihai. He had to be cautious about such cooperation. And from the beginning, Wang Xiaoyao's attitude toward this cooperation and Qin Weibai was a little vague. So, what if I don't do it? Our cooperation is cancelled. Wang Xiaoyao was silent for a moment and suddenly said. Qin Weibai stood motionless as if she didn't hear Wang Xiaoyao's words. She just stood there without saying a word. The atmosphere on the cliff suddenly froze. Time passed slowly and Qin Weibai didn't mean to speak. But saint and military counselor standing on both sides behind her gradually became clear and finally blurred. But this time the blurriness was not to deliberately hide their existence. In an instant, the cliff was covered by an endless amount of sharp sword intent. Saint's figure had completely disappeared, and the whole cliff became a world of swords. The sword intent surged and grew endlessly. Military counselor's figure also began to blur. In the sword intent, he seemed to have become a black hole, suppressing and crazily devouring everything around him. So, I have no choice, right? Wang Xiaoyao laughed at himself and looked at Qin Weibai. Yes. Qin Weibai's tone was indifferent, with a high and mighty reservation. If the target dies, you and I cooperate. Or if the target dies, you also die. So many choices. Wang Xiaoyao nodded and looked along Qin Weibai's line of sight. His eyes also fell on the village a few kilometers away. He frowned slightly and said, "Where is he?" "There." Qin Weibai pointed and said slowly, "He's coming." Looking in the direction of Qin Weibai's finger, Wang Xiaoyao could vaguely see a figure walking slowly from the village at the end of his sight. Because of the distance, Wang Xiaoyao could only recognize that it was a figure. "Kill him." Qin Weibai said, "You and I cooperate." Wang Xiaoyao nodded in silence and narrowed his eyes slightly. The sea breeze blew past with a fishy and salty smell. The cold air pervaded the air, carrying with it a hidden killing intent. As dawn approached, the bright moon slowly fell from the sky. The moonlight gradually dissipated. The sun had not yet risen. The figure that walked out of the village was alone, silently walking in the darkest hour of the day. There was no dawn. Chapter 204. 11,000-word chapter. The sea breeze stopped. The sound of the tide receded. The thick night gradually covered the receding moonlight. In the darkest night before dawn, the whole world seemed to return to the most oppressive silence. The last ray of moonlight sprinkled on the surface of the sea. The blue waves slowly undulated, and the clear and crystalline waves brought along a surging cold radiance, illuminating the entire beach in a misty haze. In the dim light, the figure on the beach seemed to be strolling along with a cool breeze, neither fast nor slow. The light flowed in Black Pupil's dark pupils. She quietly glanced at it, and her face suddenly changed slightly, with an unconcealable surprise. As the moonlight receded, the visibility under the curtain of night had been reduced to the minimum. However, that person was at the extreme end of the line of sight, still out of everyone's observation range. So until now, no one had been able to see who the young heavenly son that Qin Weibai had mentioned was. But Black Pupil was different. Her dark eyes, which had almost no white, looked creepy, but she was gifted. From childhood to adulthood, her sight range and visibility were much stronger than others. Because of this visual advantage, Black Pupil became one of the most valuable talents in the Wang family of Beihai. In terms of strength, Black Pupil, who was infinitely close to the half-step invincible realm and still had room for improvement, was enough to make no one dare to look down on her. And because of her visual advantage, she was also one of the most terrible snipers in the Wang family of Beihai. Therefore, under the circumstance that no one could see clearly in the distance through the dark night, only Kurom could clearly see the beach in the distance and the figures in the distance. Black Pupil's pupils contracted obviously, and her eyes became more and more focused. In her sight, the so-called young heavenly son was more than young. He was completely a teenager. At a distance of nearly 300 meters, Black Pupil could clearly see the figure and appearance of the other party under the focus of her eyes. In her sight, it was a face that was not only young but also childish. 16 years old? 17 years old? Or 18 years old? He walked on the beach with a calm face, wearing the junior high school uniform of East Island, carrying a school bag and seemed to be on his way to school. For a moment, Black Pupil only felt extremely absurd. It was absurd to go to school so early. However, it was equally absurd for Qin Weibai, the second in command of the Samsara Palace, to kill a junior high school student. In such an important cooperation between Wang Xiaoyao and Samsara, it was absurd for him to sacrifice the life of such a child as a pledge of allegiance. It was ridiculous for Qin Weibai to say that she was no match for this child. Kurom stood there a little sluggishly and forgot to speak for a while. The young man on the beach was getting closer, and the others could see him clearly. Is that him? Wang Xiaoyao finally saw the teenager on the coast clearly. His eyes widened, and he looked at Qin Weibai in astonishment, with undisguised suspicion. Not only Wang Xiaoyao, but even the deeply hidden aura of saint and military counselor also fluctuated slightly. Obviously they were also a little incredulous. This was a young man who still looked childish. He had an average height and appearance, but he looked very clean. Be it his clothes or face, they were all very clean. But other than that, there seemed to be nothing else worth paying attention to. The deep night, the boundless sea. In the huge environment, the thin and small figure walked quietly. It was calm, but there was a hint of loneliness. Qin Weibai's bright and condensed eyes were still clear, but there was a little trance in them. At this moment she thought of Li Tianlan. The man who had been destined in her destiny, a few years ago, many years ago, was he also like the young man in front of her, walking alone and calmly in the vast mountain forest? How is this person? Qin Weibai was silent for a while and suddenly asked. Her face was calm and perfect, but her heart was always surging violently. Ordinary. Wang Xiaoyao shook his head and glanced at Qin Weibai beside him. Is it possible that you found the wrong person? Qin Weibai raised the corner of her mouth with a sneer, indescribably arrogant and cold. She stared at the young man's eyebrows and eyes at the foot of the mountain seriously. Perhaps it was because of the first impression. At this time the other person's eyebrows and eyes were so clear and even a little dazzling. I can't see clearly, Saint suddenly said. The sharp sword intent hovering around him had completely become dormant. His calm voice seemed to be faintly hesitant. I can't see clearly either. It's very strange. Can't see clearly? Can't see clearly? Wang Xiaoyao frowned and turned his eyes again to the young man who might die in his hands. The young man by the sea was getting closer and closer. At a distance of tens of meters, they could almost see every expression on his face. Ordinary, calm and dull. The young man seemed to be thinking about something and looked a little lost in thought. It's very strange. Military counselor's voice sounded in his ear, with a trace of unexplainable doubt. He looks too ordinary, so ordinary that it's a little fake? No, this feeling is very strange. Real and unreal. Qin Weibai said softly without batting an eyelid. Wang Xiaoyao, who had been silently observing the young man, suddenly trembled, and his pupils suddenly contracted. He finally found the young man's abnormality. The night was spreading. The waves were undulating. The young man in front of him walked unhurriedly on the beach, but his every move brought a clear and almost strange sense of reality. Everything about him seemed to be placed in front of them and could be seen through at a glance. But if they observed carefully, they would find that the so-called seeing through was no different from not seeing at all. He was very real, but his whole person did not have any emotion or temperament. Between the real and the unreal, there was no disguise, no self, only a very real emptiness. It was like a mass of air. He clearly saw it, but it seemed that he didn't see it. It was the first time that Wang Xiaoyao had felt this strange feeling. For a moment all the hair on his body even stood up, and he even felt that he had seen a ghost. Young Heavenly Son? Young Heavenly Son? Qin Weibai's evaluation suddenly became very heavy in his heart. His face was solemn and he slowly said, This person is not simple. Who the hell is he? Such a person made him instinctively feel strange and dangerous, even frightened. It was almost an intuition. On the surface, Wang Xiaoyao's strength was at the stabilization phase of the thunder-shocking realm, but he was already in his early 30s, and his actual strength had already reached the half-step invincible realm. Although he hadn't reached the level of saint and military counselor yet, he didn't have to be afraid of a young man. What he worried and even feared was the future of the young man in front of him. If he was really a young heavenly son, he would definitely be a figure that no one dared to ignore in the dark world in the future. Qin Weibai didn't speak, just quietly watched the young man getting closer and closer. The soft wind blew her clothes. In a trance, this extraordinary woman who was regarded as a goddess by countless people in the dark world became more and more ethereal and dreamy. No one knew what the young man in front of him meant to the dark world, to East Island, and to the upcoming battle of Changdao. Military counselor didn't know, neither did Saint. If Li Tianlan was the target that Qin Weibai had to protect at all costs in the Battle of Changdao, the young man in front of him was the target that she would kill at all costs. The two seemed to be unrelated, but were they really? The memories rang clearly with the sound of the tide, and then turned into a huge wave, crazily attacking all her reason. In fact, it had nothing to do with the poison of coldness and the poison of heat, and it had nothing to do with the deal between Samsara and that mysterious force. Even if there was nothing, she had to kill the young man in front of her. It was just that after the two kinds of strange poisons, her mentality had completely changed. Should I do it now? Wang Xiaoyao hesitated and asked. He still didn't know the strength of the young man in front of him, but the more he observed, the more urgent he felt. There seemed to be an intuition that reminded him of the threat that the young man in front of him posed to him, so he couldn't wait to make a move. He took a step forward, and a trace of killing intent flashed in his eyes. This killing intent suppressed infinite sharpness, but it was very weak, so weak that it was almost imperceptible. But almost at the same time, the young man, who was walking forward silently and seemed to be distracted, suddenly stopped. They were dozens of meters apart, separated by the darkest night. The young man instantly raised his head and looked at the cliff. All of a sudden, Wang Xiaoyao only felt that he saw two stars. It was a pair of eyes that suddenly condensed all the brilliance, clear and calm with a trace of playfulness and playfulness. The afterglow of the moon seemed to concentrate on him all at once, making him look more real and more illusory. Who's there? He slowly opened his mouth, and his soft voice carried the hoarseness of a young boy's voice changing period. It was as gentle as the night wind blowing in the ear. Such a keen perception was simply incredible. Although the two sides were only dozens of meters apart, that was only a horizontal distance. One was above and the other was below, and there was a cliff rising from the ground. At such a distance, the other party could instantly lock their position with a trace of killing intent. It was simply... Wang Xiaoyao's eyes had completely condensed, and the fierce killing intent flashed in his pupils. He took another step forward and was about to jump off the cliff. Saint. Qin Weibai suddenly spoke softly. Saint silently took a step forward. You go. Qin Weibai said faintly, make it quick. Wang Xiaoyao was stunned, and then he understood. Even if Qin Weibai wanted him to kill the teenager below, she didn't want him to do it now. It seemed that Qin Weibai just wanted him to end the teenager's life instead of fighting with him in person. He raised his eyebrows and didn't say anything. Obviously, the teenager below had secrets, and Qin Weibai didn't seem to want to expose these secrets, so she asked Saint to do it. At this moment, Wang Xiaoyao's heart was full of strange feelings. In the current situation of East Island, who on earth was this teenager that Qin Weibai secretly came to Ninghu to kill? What impact could it have on the current situation? In recent years, Wang Xiaoyao had learned too much about this woman who made him unable to extricate himself from the first time he met her. He could be sure that if the teenager below was an insignificant person who had nothing to do with the general trend, even if he was a young heavenly son, Qin Weibai wouldn't be in a hurry to kill such a person. Okay. Saint responded faintly, took a step forward, and rushed off the cliff without hesitation. His body wrapped in a black cloak fell at a high speed, and the sword energy, like a flash flood, stirred the night and rushed directly to the teenager by the beach. The dull thunder suddenly rolled across the sky, and the thunder fell. The sword energy tore the night, and the hundreds of meters of the night sky was instantly dyed into a strange blue curtain by the sword energy. The curtain was like lightning with a fierce killing intent that could destroy everything. The sword energy was majestic and mighty. In an instant, the teenager who had stood quietly by the sea completely changed. His figure became clearer under the blue light curtain, but his momentum became more and more illusory. Under the sharp light of the mighty sword energy, the teenager had a vague feeling that he was almost dissipating between heaven and earth. Only his eyes were still bright and clear. They passed through the light curtain made of sword energy through the night, and directly shot to the cliff. It was clear and calm, but it was filled with a kind of suppressed ferocity. Saint's body had landed. In front of him, the light curtain made of sword energy was still expanding, and almost in the blink of an eye, it completely enveloped the teenager. The sword chi was wreaking havoc in the air, and the sand on the beach was shot up into the sky by the sword chi, flying hundreds of meters into the sky. Countless dark blue electric arcs danced wildly, and the whole battlefield instantly turned into a strange and dazzling world. In the blurred light and shadow, the pair of clear but ferocious eyes became brighter. The teenager didn't move, and he didn't take out any weapon. He just threw away the school bag in his hand and put his hands together. At the moment when the sword energy was about to fall, the teenager's hands suddenly made a complicated and strange emblematic gesture. This was a unique skill that had never appeared in the dark world. It was strange. It was unknown. Formless seal. Heaven and earth were formless and all living beings were formless. The sword energy, which was as dense as a curtain, rushed past the teenager almost violently. The teenager's body seemed to flicker very slightly. The next second, his extremely thin body had appeared directly in front of Saint. Fast. He was as fast as a ghost. Wang Xiaoyao, who had been staring at all this, didn't even see how he avoided the violent sword energy for a while. The teenager's hands were still put together, his fingers changed, and a new emblematic gesture was suddenly formed again. The temperature in the air plummeted. The midsummer suddenly turned into cold winter, and the world seemed to become absolutely indifferent. Crack. In the clear sound, the high sky above suddenly condensed into a layer of ice. The ice spread wildly and almost instantly spread to a range of hundreds of meters. The emblematic gesture in the teenager's hands was completely formed. Boom. The ice of hundreds of meters shook violently and then completely shattered. Countless sharp pieces of ice, like spears, kept falling from the sky with a sharp whistle. Heartless seal. The soft wind, the dark night, and the cold moon. Everything disappeared in an instant, and there was only the violent killing intent and extreme indifference left on the whole battlefield. Swish. Without any hesitation, Saint pulled out the long sword behind him at the first time. The boss said to finish the battle as soon as possible, so from the beginning he went all out. The light on the bright sword edge jumped, and a touch of dangerous blue condensed to the extreme immediately filled the sword edge. The teenager and Saint were already very close. When the sword edge was raised, the tip of the sword almost touched the teenager's chest. The blue edge silently cut through the teenager's school uniform, and the teenager's figure had already soared into the sky. What moved with his body was still the emblematic gesture. His emblematic gesture had become more and more complicated, and the fast emblematic gesture had brought out a large number of clear shadows. It went up. It kept going up. Saint raised his sword and looked up. The teenager's figure had appeared in the air at a height of nearly 100 meters. The emblematic gesture was completely condensed. Infinite seal. Boom. There was a sudden burst of thunder at the highest point of the sky. A blue and purple light spot suddenly appeared high in the sky and fell straight down from the sky. The light spot kept getting bigger, and in the blink of an eye, it became a thick and almost terrifying lightning crossing the sky and the earth. Thunder-shocking realm. Except for Qin Weibai. Everyone's face changed completely. This was not even the most basic thunder-shocking realm, but an expert who was infinitely close to the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. Teenager in the thunder-shocking realm? How could this be possible? How on earth could his body bear the power of the thunder-shocking realm? The look in Saint's eyes also changed. He had already overestimated the teenager in the sky, but he did not expect that the other party was actually close to the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. When Qin Weibai said that Black Pupil was no match for him, Saint did not think much about it. He thought that the other party was at most at the peak of the fire-flaming realm, or similar to the state of Li Tianlan in the half-step thunder-shocking realm. If he was a real heavenly son, that kind of strength was enough to barely defeat Black Pupil. Before the battle, he never thought that a teenager in his teens would have the strength infinitely close to the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. What did a heavenly son close to the peak of the thunder-shocking realm mean? It meant that the other party was enough to pose an absolutely fatal threat to him. On the cliff, military counselors subconsciously took a step forward. Wang Xiaoyao and Black Pupil's killing intent was no longer concealed. Especially Wang Xiaoyao, his whole body was cold and for the first time he felt bone-chilling fear. A 10-year-old expert at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm, not to mention how his body could bear this power, this talent was enough to make everyone's scalp numb. At this age he had reached this realm. How old could he be when he entered the invincible realm? 25 years old? 28 years old? With such talent he seemed to be stronger than Wang Xingxiao and Li Tianlan. If he grew up he would be a huge threat to everyone. Everyone. Boom. The violent thunder came down from above, and the huge lightning seemed to fall from the end of the sky. The area with a radius of tens of meters was completely shrouded by this lightning that had expanded to the limit. Looking from above, this was completely a beam of light that broke through the confinement of heaven and earth, with the power to destroy everything. This was the real power of heaven and earth. The teenager's hands still maintained the gesture, and his expression was cold. At this moment he was floating in the air, and his whole body was surrounded by lightning. He was as majestic as a god. The huge lightning fell from the sky and shrouded the surroundings. There was no way to avoid it. In the center of the lightning, Saint suddenly straightened his body, raised his arm and shook his sword. There was a sudden roar in the center of the lightning, and the ordinary long sword in Saint's hand was directly shattered. With him as the center, the air within hundreds of meters suddenly twisted and rotated crazily. Countless icicles falling from the sky instantly turned into powder. Saint's body did not move, but a storm hundreds of meters high rose around him. The storm changed from twisting to a deep blue. Endless thunder and lightning roared in the storm, and the whole space seemed to be frozen. The lightning fell from above. The storm rose from the ground. Wind and thunder gathered. The fierce whistling sound echoed around with a sharp sound that almost pierced people's eardrums. A large amount of sand was rolled into the air, and the trees and grass were completely smashed in the expanding airwaves. The impact of the wind and thunder hit everything around, and the whole cliff was shaking violently. Military Counselor was calm. The airflow in front of him was twisted, and it firmly protected Qin Weibai. The desperate power below kept colliding and the wind and thunder roared. But under the protection of Military Counselor, Qin Weibai's hair did not even flutter. The teenager's figure kept floating with the wind, and it seemed more strange and empty. He made a gesture with both hands. The air seemed to be completely torn apart, and the violent seaside seemed to have fallen from the cold winter to the hell. The cold wind rolled up the sand and whistled up. The storm around Saint was circling, but the whole space turned into deep blue with the teenager's gesture. In an instant, the last gesture in the teenager's hands was formed. The storm around Saint suddenly stagnated. Almost at the same time, a majestic divine light that could not be looked at directly suddenly flashed in Qin Weibai's bright eyes. The dead spirit seal. The battlefield suddenly quieted down. As if a dull wind was blowing slowly with extreme coldness and death aura, the whole deep blue space suddenly burst into pieces. Endless lightning swept everything in an instant, and the whole sea became a world full of lightning. The storm around Saint was torn into pieces, and even the sword energy almost disappeared. The teenager who had been making gestures looked slightly pale, and he finally stopped for a while. Saint's figure, which had rushed into the air, landed again. He raised his head and looked at the teenager in the air quietly. But under the cover of the cloak, the red blood kept flowing down the corner of his mouth, as if it would never stop. What kind of unique skill is this? Wang Xiaoyao kept taking several deep breaths and then he said with some difficulty. There were countless unique skills in the dark world, but some of them were not powerful just because the people who used them were different so they could shock the world. Some unique skills were extraordinary, and in the hands of experts, they were more fierce and domineering. Only a few unique skills shocked the world and they belonged to the top inheritance. In the hands of experts, their power was simply the best in the generation. For example, the 6 paths of reincarnation sword of the Wang family of Beihai. For example, the 24 moves of sword of the Li family. For example, the 10 skills of true martial arts of Kunlun City. He had never heard of this set of gestures of the teenager in front of him, but judging from its power, it was so domineering. He had never heard of such an inheritance before, and it was unimaginable. He hurt Saint with a strength less than the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. Even if he was a young heavenly son, it was enough to shock people. Who was Saint? The first super master of Samsara, one of the strongest experts under the invincible realm. In the dark world he could be as famous as Gong Sun Chi, the Azure Dragon of Zhongzhou State, Tribulation, the King of Shadow, and Wei Kunlun, the Nirvana Sword Master of Zhongzhou State. He belonged to the top superior of the half-step invincible realm, and he had even vaguely broken through the limit of the half-step invincible realm, but he had not really reached the invincible realm. Wang Xiaoyao did not deny the teenager's talent, but without the top inheritance of martial arts, it was impossible for him to do this. I heard my sister talk about it. Qin Weibai sighed softly. This is the immortality seal. Wang Xiaoyao was stunned. He had never heard of this name. The master of Samsara Palace mentioned it? He looked at Qin Weibai and asked subconsciously, what is the immortality seal? I don't know martial arts so I can't tell the principle. It should be imitating heaven and earth, integrating heaven and earth. It belongs to the category of momentum, pure momentum. Qin Weibai shook her head. The 6 paths of reincarnation of the Wang family of Beihai was the combination of strength and intent. It broke out in an instant and sublimated to the extreme. The 24 moves of sword of the Li family was the combination of intent and momentum. It broke everything and was unparalleled in the world. But the immortality seal in front of him was just seeking momentum, pure momentum. They were different paths of martial arts and it was hard to tell which was better. When they reached the extreme they all had the power of the generation. Wang Xiaoyao's face was a little pale. He had never heard of the immortality seal. The strength of the person who created this unique skill was simply unimaginable. Sure enough, it was not so easy to cooperate with Qin Weibai. He even felt that he had caused a huge trouble. What else do you know about the immortality seal? Wang Xiaoyao was silent for a moment and looked at Qin Weibai seriously. I don't know much. I'm not very interested in martial arts. I just heard it from my sister casually. The immortality seal should have 12 seals and 3 comprehensive moves. I don't know the rest. Qin Weibai's tone was cold. Then, Wang Xiaoyao looked at the teenager floating in the air, wanting to say something but stopping on second thought. If it's him he can at most use 9 styles and there's also a comprehensive style. That's the limit. Qin Weibai seemed to know what he wanted to ask. She said indifferently, it's already the 4th move. The conversation between the two finally attracted the teenager's attention. In the silence, the teenager's body floating in the air suddenly floated up again. The lightning almost completely wrapped his whole body, making him look like a thunder god who controlled thunder and lightning, fierce and indifferent. In the lightning, the teenager's height was already as high as the cliff. They looked at each other. The teenager's indifferent eyes suddenly flashed a trace of fierce killing intent. He sneered and said, Qin Weibai? Wang Xiaoyao. What a big battle. Is the one down there the military counselor? Or a saint? Have you thought about the consequences when you deal with me? It was standard, but it was standard and a little weird Chinese. Do you know me? Wang Xiaoyao frowned tightly. He smelled the conspiracy more and more clearly, but he had no way to escape tonight. If the Wang family of Beihai has a disaster in the future, it's all because of tonight. The teenager who had taken off all the disguises, said in a cold tone. His momentum suddenly soared. Just when everyone thought he was going to attack the cliff, his figure flashed away from the battlefield in an instant. His cold sneer came from the air. You don't deserve to kill me. Go back and wait for our revenge. Wang Xiaoyao's expression suddenly changed. He subconsciously wanted to intercept him, but the teenager's figure had flashed continuously. In the blink of an eye, he had reached the seaside. He couldn't catch up with this kind of speed at all. If he escapes tonight, Wang Xiaoyao's heart suddenly sank. At the bottom of the cliff, a ferocious roar suddenly rang out. Saint didn't hesitate and went straight to the teenager who had reached the seaside. The teenager sneered. His feet landed on the sea and he suddenly turned around. There was a sudden change when he was unprepared. The seawater under the teenager's feet suddenly exploded, and countless splashes surged. The teenager's fleeing figure hit the splashes, but his whole body didn't move forward. Instead, he instantly retreated dozens of meters. Bomb? The teenager was shocked and angry but more confused. He couldn't tell whether the explosion was a bomb or not. If it was a bomb, how could the other party bury it here in advance? Was it a coincidence? Everything happened in the blink of an eye. But the distance of dozens of meters was enough for Saint to get close to him again. The teenager's indifferent face suddenly changed. He opened his mouth and roared, "This is..." Boom! The huge roar of sword energy suddenly smashed down, drowning out all the teenager's voice. Saint raised his arms high, and the sword energy all over his body condensed crazily. A giant sword with a length of hundreds of meters appeared above his head. Saint clenched his hands and suddenly chopped down. The sword energy that almost split heaven and earth roared wildly and smashed down. A trace of ferocity flashed in the teenager's eyes, and he subconsciously dodged to the right. Boom! The giant sword fell on the sea, and hundreds of meters of seawater were split open. The huge impact made the teenager's body suddenly lose balance, and he directly spat out a mouthful of blood. No one could see what happened at that moment, and no one knew why the teenager's figure, which could have gone far, retreated. But it didn't matter at all. Wang Xiaoyao's eyes were indifferent. As soon as Saint caught up with the teenager, he had already left the cliff and rushed to the seaside at full speed. Saint's figure was close to the teenager in an instant. He didn't have a sword in his hand, but there were hundreds and thousands of blue sword shadows whistling around him. One after another, the long swords kept exploding, bringing with them a destructive power. The whole place shook violently in the fierce collisions. Wang Xiaoyao's figure quickly approached the seaside. If the teenager ran away, the entire Wang family of Beihai would provoke a big enemy in the future. The Wang family of Beihai was not afraid of trouble, but no one wanted to trouble themselves. So this time he didn't hide his strength at all. In the roar of thunder and sea water, his body drove the electric light straight into the battlefield. They were dozens of meters apart. Wang Xiaoyao opened his hands and a giant sword dozens of meters long suddenly condensed in his hands. The giant sword was heavy and sharp, and with an almost unstoppable sharpness, it turned in Wang Xiaoyao's hands. Wang Xiaoyao held his palm and swept the sword. The endless seawater suddenly exploded, and the giant sword, like opening the sky, swept with abundant and irresistible sword intent. Infinite killing intent suddenly broke out on the sea. 6 paths of reincarnation, sort of king path. There was finally a trace of undisguised eagerness in the teenager's indifferent eyes, and he suddenly said, "I am..." Boom! Thousands of long swords sprang out of the water again, and the roar was completely intended to cover up the teenager's words. Countless long swords condensed from seawater flashed with thunder and rushed to the teenager's back. Saint was silent, and he made up his mind not to let the teenager say a word. "You." The teenager's eyes suddenly stood up. Saint's sword energy and Wang Xiaoyao's sword intent almost shrouded him at the same time. The teenager seemed to know that he couldn't be kind today, and he went completely crazy. Thunder and lightning were blooming all over his body. In the face of the siege of Saint and Wang Xiaoyao, he didn't retreat at all, but chose to fight desperately. "All of you go to hell." The teenager roared with all his strength, and the handprint of his hands changed again. In the thunder and lightning, a large area of seawater suddenly surged and shook. The waves turned over and countless seawater instantly rose. Cecile. In the roar that seemed to destroy the world, countless seawater violently rushed to the sky. For a moment the world was turning over. The sea turned into a mountain and the sky. The originally calm sea instantly set off a huge wave as high as 100 feet. The huge waves kept rising and almost covered the sky. In the almost suffocating scene, the huge waves surged down with irresistible force. The teenager's expression was cold. At this moment, his every move had a kind of dazzling style, and the momentum was so strong that it could almost split the sky. The huge waves were like landslides. Wang Xiaoyao's giant sword and Saint's thunder and lightning were instantly submerged by the huge waves. Their bodies went up against the current in the huge waves, shaking constantly. The huge waves suppressed the thunder and the giant sword and fell on the coast. The whole coastline seemed to be shaking, and the place where the huge waves hit directly left a deep pit with a length of hundreds of meters. The teenager, who had been completely crazy, did not stop and made another handprint. Above the sea, his body suddenly shot straight into the sky. Star River Seal. Instantly, all the glimmers in the heavens and the earth seemed to have converged onto the young man. The young man was like a young god that had descended to the mortal world, and his entire body was covered in a cold and lethal light that seemed like a boundless and boundless river of stars. Saint and Wang Xiaoyao raised their hands instinctively. High in the sky, the teenager, whose every move seemed to be able to destroy the world, suddenly swooped down with endless light. Pseudo-domain. Wang Xiaoyao suddenly let out a scream. The teenager's swooping body was close to Saint and Wang Xiaoyao, with the whole galaxy and the whole sky. The figures of Saint and Wang Xiaoyao fell into the deep sea with the teenager in an instant. The monstrous thunder and lightning continued to spread on the sea, and the dark blue kept rising and spreading on the sea. The whole sea began to spin wildly with the teenager as the center. Attack first. Still attack first. The teenager, who had made up his mind, had a great courage to ignore life and death. The moment the three fell into the sea, a new handprint was formed again. Samsara Seal. The dark blue sea suddenly turned into a huge whirlpool that could swallow everything. Saint and Wang Xiaoyao, who had no time to adjust, were constantly spinning with the whirlpool, and their bodies were almost completely out of balance. This was not a pseudo-domain, but it could make the body lose control. Wasn't it a pseudo-domain in another sense? Endless thunder and lightning continued to condense in the whirlpool, and one after another kept hitting Wang Xiaoyao. Wang Xiaoyao's body shook violently, and his strong aura instantly weakened. Saint suddenly snorted coldly. In the fiercely spinning whirlpool, a blazing fire instantly burned on the sea. The thick whirlpool evaporated rapidly, and even a large amount of thunder and lightning began to be completely obliterated. The teenager let out a long roar. His body rose into the air again, and his hands made a handprint. Ling Xiao Seal. The sea calmed down in the turbulence. There was no change in the sky. But the teenager's eyes were blood red. As the handprint was completed, his aura instantly soared. The peak of the thunder-shocking realm. Saint and Wang Xiaoyao were startled. How similar was this handprint to the unique skill of the Wang family of Beihai, against the way of heaven? The teenager finished the handprint, but he did not stop. His face was frighteningly pale, but his movements became more and more determined, with inviolable pride and coldness. The 9th handprint. Divine Punishment handprint. The light around the teenager suddenly expanded and instantly spread into a halo with a range of hundreds of meters. The handprint was completed. In the roar of thunder, countless thunder and lightning suddenly appeared in the air. 10, 100, 1,000, within a radius of hundreds of meters, the area covered by the halo instantly became a hell of thunder and lightning. Saint resisted with all his strength, but he was shocked to find that all the thunder and lightning, fire, and even ice within the scope of the halo were all sucked out. All he could rely on was the sword and only the sword energy. The dense thunder and lightning kept falling from the sky, like the wrath of heaven. Wang Xiaoyao could hardly hold on and coughed up blood. He held on, subconsciously glanced at Saint and smiled bitterly. Although Saint did his best, he did not use all his unique skills. His so-called full strength was just the power of his realm. But from beginning to end, Saint's sword only had sword energy, not sword intent. It was self-evident what this meant. Among the 12 super masters of Samsara, the other super masters might be mysterious, but there were traces to follow. Only military counselor and Saint had no information to search for. The two of them seemed to have appeared out of thin air. It could only be said that the two most mysterious heavenly kings had hidden themselves very well, so well that no one knew who they really were. Sword intent was the easiest clue to guess a person's real origin. But Saint did not use the slightest sword intent from beginning to end. In other words, he did not use any unique skills. If not, he would not be so passive. At this time, did he still want to hide his identity? Wang Xiaoyao vomited blood, and his consciousness gradually faded. The thunder and lightning in the sky finally fell. In the night, the young man's cold and arrogant voice sounded again, with extreme killing intent and undisguised weakness. "I'll send you on your way." His hands formed seals again. This time, the seals were obviously much faster than before, but it was also much longer. One by one, the seals were completed quickly. The youth's extremely powerful aura instantly became extremely weak, but the seals were still continuing. Wang Xiaoyao suddenly thought of Qin Weibai's words. His lips moved and he struggled to say, "Comprehensive style?" Boom. The world seemed to shake suddenly. The young man's gestures had been completed, and endless light gushed out of his body. It was dazzling enough to cover up everything and sharp enough to stir the whole world. Behind the immortality seal, it turned out to be the edge of the sword. There was no thunder, fire, or ice in the light. There was only wind. It was gentle and soft. It was illusory. The wind that destroyed everything. Comprehensive style. Emptiness and infinity. The world was empty, but the deadly danger was endless. Saint suddenly widened his eyes as if he couldn't believe it. But he immediately reacted, gave a long roar and jumped up. His body sank into the light and disappeared completely. No one could see everything clearly. They only felt that the world was surging, and the light completely covered all the pictures. In the young man's unwilling and desperate roar, the dangerous light and sharp edge instantly expanded and burst. The sword intent, which was so complicated that it was extremely difficult to identify, surged and scattered. In the light, the figures of Saint and the young man fell from the sky at the same time. The young man's mouth was full of blood, and there seemed to be some minced flesh of his tongue. In the last sword, Saint was slightly better, but he deliberately crushed the young man's tongue. In the end, it was a lose-lose situation. From beginning to end, Saint didn't let the young man say anything. They didn't even know his name. The young man's body fell to the ground and his breath was weak, but he looked unusually calm. The battlefield was completely quiet. The sound of light footsteps came through the night. No one knew when Qin Weibai had walked down the cliff and came to the front of the young man. She looked at his eyes calmly. When the young man saw Qin Weibai, his calm face suddenly became excited. He stared at her and struggled to move to Qin Weibai. Although he couldn't speak, everyone could feel the unwillingness and questioning in his eyes. But Qin Weibai's eyes were more complicated. "Do you want to know why I killed you?" Qin Weibai looked at the young man and suddenly asked softly. The young man's struggling body stopped, and he just stared at Qin Weibai's dreamy and perfect face, panting heavily. Because some people seem to have no weakness, but their biggest weakness is responsibility. He is and so is he. Qin Weibai said calmly, and I happen to have the least sense of responsibility. The young man's eyes narrowed and he seemed to be relieved, but then his eyes became cold and mocking. Qin Weibai's eyes gradually became cold, with some inexplicable hatred. The young man's eyes seemed to irritate her. She said coldly, "I know you are not convinced, but I won't give you a chance. Your road to the heavenly sun ends here." The fear in the young man's eyes flashed away. He clenched his teeth and closed his eyes. Qin Weibai turned her head and glanced at Wang Xiaoyao, who was weak but still awake. "Kill him," she whispered. Wang Xiaoyao hesitated, but he still walked over. "I want to see it with my own eyes." Qin Weibai's tone was as light as the wind, but it was mixed with the ice and snow of deep winter. "I want to see you kill him with my own eyes and burn his bones to ashes." Burn his bones to ashes. How deep was his obsession? Wang Xiaoyao's body trembled slightly, and a long sword condensed from lightning took shape in his hand. He hesitated, but finally raised his hand and stabbed the young man's throat with it. The young man's vitality quickly disappeared. Under the lightning he finally turned into a pile of ashes. The heavenly sun died. Qin Weibai turned and left calmly. The young heavenly sun was born without a name and died without a name. Chapter 205. No matter how the general trend of the dark world changed for ordinary people, this world seemed to be a pure land forever. The light and harmony covered all the dark killings. Under the rain and snow, outside the dark world, there were countless joys and sorrows. In the secular world, everyone was living for themselves and pursuing what they were interested in. In the bustling atmosphere of Zhongzhou State, the word fairyland suddenly became popular on the internet. At first, only some people were discussing it, but as time went by, more and more words about fairyland began to appear in major forums and news. For a time, it became popular all over Zhongzhou State, and it seemed that all the people were exploring it. Zhongzhou State had freedom of speech and the news industry was extremely developed. Although the government learned the news in the first place and controlled the relevant public opinion after receiving the order, some news and pictures were quickly deleted. The enthusiasm of netizens did not diminish at all. Descriptions and pictures about fairyland popped up from time to time. Although they were quickly deleted, more and more people saved the pictures and then tried to understand the relevant inside story. The government kept blocking the news, but there were more and more descriptions about fairyland. Today it had formed an almost irrepressible wave. Because this so-called fairyland was not a flash, but a real existence. Fairyland was a mountain, or to be exact, a part of a mountain, located on the shore of West Lake in Lin'an. Inside Lonely Mountain, Mount Qingyun. As one of the magnificent sights of West Lake, Lonely Mountain was visited by tourists every day, and the legend of the so-called fairyland arose. At this time it was midsummer, and the temperature in Lin'an was extremely hot. However, the Lonely Mountain by the West Lake was incredibly cool, especially in the northwest of the Lonely Mountain. Around the magnificent Lonely Peak, which occupied about 3/10 of the entire area of the Lonely Mountain, there was a cold mist rising in the midsummer. It was a vast expanse of whiteness, almost covering the entire mountain. When the cold mist first rose, no one noticed it. But as time went by, the cold mist here became thicker and more obvious, which finally aroused the curiosity of others. When the first tourist walked up Lonely Mountain and entered the cold mist of Mount Qingyun, everything he saw turned into shock. Flowers were blooming all over Mount Qingyun. In the middle of summer July, in this unbelievably cool environment, flowers like wintersweet and daffodils that should never bloom in summer actually bloomed. Some plants that did not belong to summer were also in full bloom. The entire Qingyun hill was surging with clouds and mist. The grass and trees were fresh, in a blur of indistinct ignorance, as if straight into a fairyland. The cold fog on Mount Qingyun did not dissipate, but became thicker and thicker. When more and more tourists entered Mount Qingyun and discovered that the cold fog could even isolate sound, it finally caused a great commotion and curiosity. The cold mist spread but did not leave Mount Qingyun. The white mist was dense. It was as if one person was standing in the white fog while the other was outside. Even if they were less than a meter apart, they would not be able to transmit any sound. This was simply a supernatural phenomenon. It was inconceivable and incomprehensible. The fairyland became famous in Zhongzhou State. When the public opinion was completely out of control, the government finally made a strong response. Lonely Mountain closed the mountain on the grounds of internal reorganization. Even a large area of water near Lonely Mountain had been completely blocked, and a sign saying no visitors were allowed. Ordinary people might not know what Mount Qingyun was, but every high-level official in Zhongzhou State knew it very well. Mount Qingyun and Qingyun Temple were the secluded places of Great Master Wuwei, a metaphysics grandmaster in Zhongzhou State. Although the cold fog in summer could not be explained for the time being, when Great Master Wuwei came out, there would always be an explanation. But time passed from May to June and then to July. August was approaching. Not to mention Great Master Wuwei, even his 2 disciples in Qingyun Temple had not given any explanation. Qingyun Temple remained silent. Only the vast white fog kept spreading, enveloping the temple with the most fate in all of Lin and the whole Jiangsu province, and even the whole south of Zhongzhou State. The white fog never left Mount Qingyun, but kept circling and spreading toward the very high sky. In a few months the cold fog kept rising, and now it almost covered the whole sky. From a distance, the white fog rising from below was like a heavenly pillar, running through heaven and earth, connecting the top and the bottom. There seemed to be an extremely vast and awe-inspiring power in the dark. Mount Qingyun had completely disappeared in the white fog, and no one could see the scene in it anymore. The darkest time before dawn had passed, and the sky began to shimmer. The blue water of West Lake stirred gently in the morning light, spreading to the distance with faint ripples. In a quiet world, a lone boat passed through the plainclothes and armed police station near the water area as if there was no one else around, and approached the blocked Lonely Mountain at a steady pace. Lonely Mountain was looming in the dim environment, and only the cold fog in the northwest was still clear, connecting heaven and earth and covering everything inside. Fate leakage. On the lone boat, a thin but tall figure was riding alone on the boat, moving slowly on the water surface. He wore a neat Taoist robe and a Taoist crown. He held a horsetail whisk in his hand, looking formal and solemn. In the somewhat dark environment, he looked at the area where the cold mist was rising with a solemn expression. His wise and clear eyes seemed to be able to see through everything, with an indescribable brilliance. In the end you still couldn't hold on. Xian Xuanzi, an eccentric of Taoism in Zhongzhou State. Now he was a metaphysics grandmaster who was as famous as Great Master Wuwei. Only Xian Xuanzi was qualified to visit Great Master Wuwei's place of seclusion to understand the situation. The water rippled slightly. The lone boat approached the shore. Xian Xuanzi, who looked like a sage and was dressed very formally, slowly landed on the shore. The armed police stationed on the shore looked confused and took 2 steps forward subconsciously. Before he spoke, Xian Xuanzi had already handed over a certificate with a peaceful smile. The armed police took the certificate and glanced at it. He stood up straight and gave a military salute reflexively. Xian Xuanzi took the certificate back with a smile. Looking at the cold fog close at hand, his eyes became more and more solemn. He carefully tidied up his Taoist robe and wiped off the dust and water stains on his body. Then he took a deep breath and walked into the cold fog in front of him with the horsetail whisk in his hand. The white fog was so dense that it seemed to be a mass of air that could not be dispelled. But strangely, in the white fog, the visibility was not as low as imagined. In the surging fog, one could clearly see the blooming flowers under their feet, one after another. The petals were stained with moisture, gently swaying in the morning breeze and shining with an almost enchanting luster. Walking along the fog, the former stone path was almost completely covered by plants and flowers that had grown in recent months. The road ahead had completely disappeared, and everywhere in sight was full of vitality. But as the white mist drifted away, there was a clear sense of desolation. Xian Xuanzi's face was expressionless. He stepped softly among the flowers and went all the way up to Qingyun Temple. The cold fog in the mountain seemed to be getting thicker. The fog drifted slower and slower, as if it had been stagnant in the air. Xian Xuanzi frowned and slightly quickened his pace. The road under his feet went straight up. A faint light lit up in front of him. The faint yellow light drifted so fast that it was almost illusory, as if it was guiding the way forward. In the fog, an abundant and loud voice sounded in front of him, with a peaceful and tranquil smile. "Excuse me for not going out to greet you, honorable guest. It's dark and the road is slippery. Be careful of your steps." "Master, you're welcome." Xian Xuanzi paused and continued to go up. "In Mount Qingyun there is no day and night. All I see is luck." He stepped on the plant-covered steps with a calm look, but the horsetail whisk in his hand shook slightly. In an instant the cold fog in front of Xian Xuanzi surged wildly, and the fog twisted and retreated in front of him. In just a few seconds the fog in front of Xian Xuanzi had all drifted to the left and right sides. In front of him, Mount Qingyun, which had been shrouded in cold fog for months, became clearer than ever. Dozens of meters away, the inconspicuous gate of Qingyun Temple appeared in his sight. Two middle-aged monks in monk robes stood in front of the gate, supporting an old man with disheveled hair. Xian Xuanzi's somewhat complicated eyes gradually turned cold. He stood there for a while, then slowly moved forward. The distance of dozens of meters was getting closer. The three people in front of the temple gate remained motionless. "Master, how have you been?" The white fog retreated to the left and right. Facing the pure and fresh air, Xian Xuanzi slowly came to the gate of the temple and asked with a smile. The two middle-aged monks lowered their heads and remained silent. Great Master Wu Wei, who looked like an eminent monk a few months ago, now had disheveled hair. His gray hair had lost its luster, and his long hair had reached his shoulders. He was dressed in ordinary clothes and no longer had the air of an eminent monk. Hearing Xian Xuanzi's sarcastic greeting, Great Master Wu Wei still looked peaceful. He smiled calmly, pointed to the white mist in front of him, and then pointed to his long gray hair and said in a gentle voice, "I'm barely good enough. How are you?" "I'm fine." Xian Xuanzi nodded. He seemed to sigh with emotion, but the coldness in his eyes became more and more obvious. "Master, you lost after all." "I will win." Great Master Wu Wei smiled. His voice was still loud and firm, but the luster in his eyes was dim and weak. "If you didn't face the tribulation and bear the karma for the demoness, you would have a chance. But now, how can you win?" Xian Xuanzi looked at the living Buddha in front of him, who was like a myth in the hearts of the higher-ups of Zhongzhou state. His expression was confused, disappointed, and puzzled. He reached out and pointed to the white hair on the living Buddha's head. He said quietly, "With ease? Demoness?" Great Master Wu Wei's mood did not fluctuate at all. The luster in his eyes, which could see through all karma in the past, dimmed, leaving only a smile, sincerity, compassion, and tranquility, just like the West Lake under Mount Qingyun. "She doesn't belong to the mortal world and she's not a demoness. Is she a divine?" Xian Xuanzi's tone became colder and colder. "She's my tribulation." Great Master Wu Wei shook his head slowly. "With our abilities, even if it's a tribulation, so what? We can always avoid it." Xian Xuanzi's tone was proud, but the puzzlement and doubt in it became more obvious. "Isn't it karma to avoid it?" Great Master Wu Wei asked in reply. He looked at Xian Xuanzi with faint eyes. The smile in his pupils gradually disappeared, and his eyes became quiet and deep. Xian Xuanzi was silent. After a long time he said faintly, "I don't agree with you." This was a conflict of metaphysics cognition and a divergence of ideas. Great Master Wu Wei obviously did not intend to persuade Xian Xuanzi. He just smiled gently and said, "Our differences have always existed, but in a few years, everything will be clear. There's no time." Xian Xuanzi suddenly spoke. He turned around and looked at the white cold mist in Mount Qingyun. "This is your fate, the fate of Qingyun Temple. Now it's leaking. In a few years? Can you still hold on? Even if you can, the higher-ups won't be patient. Now the situation is delicate. They can't wait for a few months, let alone a few years." Great Master Wu Wei's eyes narrowed slightly. He looked at the expressionless Xian Xuanzi seriously, and after a long silence he said faintly, "So, you chose them in the end?" "They chose me." Xian Xuanzi turned to look at Great Master Wu Wei and said calmly, "Don't you understand?" "I don't." Great Master Wu Wei smiled and shook his head. There was stubbornness and persistence in his calm expression. "The one at the top won't agree, will he? That's the general trend. He can only go with the flow." Xian Xuanzi shook his head. "The general trend will change." Great Master Wu Wei was still smiling, very indifferent and fearless. "How can the general trend change?" Xian Xuanzi subconsciously raised his voice, and his tone became a little aggressive. "What's the general trend?" Great Master Wu Wei asked calmly. Xian Xuanzi looked at Great Master Wu Wei thoughtfully. His patience seemed to be gradually disappearing, and his tone began to become cold. "East Island? Are you talking about Li Tianlan? He was no longer a variable, just a pawn. He was going against heaven and the general trend. Even if he was the chosen one, so what? When he died. Great Master, you were too stubborn. So when you met him for the first time, you wanted to lead him to Wuxia province in the future? In that case you have already made a choice, haven't you?" Great Master Wu Wei sighed. Xian Xuanzi suddenly froze, expressionless, and said no more. "I will win." After a moment of silence, Great Master Wu Wei whispered again, "Why not go against heaven? The world thinks that we are the most sober because we see through everything, but it is because we see through everything that we are the most muddle-headed. I don't want to go on. Even if I go against heaven's secrets once, so what? Besides, are heaven's secrets, luck and fate really doomed to be unchangeable? You know this better than I do. Xian Xuanzi's face seemed to be a little livid. He fiercely shook the horsetail whisk in his hand and said coldly, "Ridiculous. Ignorant." Great Master Wu Wei shook his head and stopped talking. Maybe you're right. But the demonists messed up your plan and you can't hold on anymore. They chose me. So, if you don't want to commit treason, please cooperate with me. Xian Xuanzi looked at the white mist condensed by fate in the distance. After a while he slowly said, "I will give up Qingyun Temple." Great Master Wu Wei's tone was calm. "But it can only be Qingyun Temple. I'm responsible for Zhongzhou State." A trace of anger flashed in Xian Xuanzi's eyes. He snorted, ignored the three people in front of the door and strode into the temple. Great Master Wu Wei still didn't move. His eyes seemed to look through the cold mist in front of him, quietly appreciating the ripples on the surface of the West Lake. "Master." The first disciple, Ruzhen, hesitated for a long time and finally couldn't help asking, "Master, what are you talking about with Xian Xuanzi? About winning or losing?" Great Master Wu Wei smiled and looked at his first disciple. "What do you want to say?" "We are monks." Ruzhen's lips moved. He looked at his master's eyes and his voice finally fell silent. "Yes, we are monks. It doesn't matter whether we win or lose. But in this era, how can monks let go of all the fetters? After all, monks are still Zhongzhou State people." Xian Xuanzi sighed deeply and for the first time, there was a touch of worry in his eyes. He was silent. After a full 5 minutes he continued to say, "Xian Xuanzi and I are not fighting for winning or losing, but for the fate of the country. To be exact, it's the dragon vein of Zhongzhou State." Dragon vein? Ruzhen trembled all over and suddenly raised his head, his face full of astonishment. "Zhongzhou State? Hey, the dragon vein of Zhongzhou State has been lost." Great Master Wu Wei laughed at himself. A few simple words, but the news contained was earth-shattering. Ruzhen was so shocked by this short sentence that he felt dizzy. The dragon vein of Zhongzhou State had been lost? How was that possible? The dragon vein was related to the fate of a country. It could be said that it was the fate of a country. Maybe many people didn't believe in fate, but on the contrary many people believed in luck. This alone could explain the reality of fate, but it was difficult for ordinary people to guide it. The fate of a person and the fate of a country did not change much in terms of quality, mainly in terms of quantity. Therefore, most of the fate of a country needed to be carried by the dragon vein, and the dragon vein of Zhongzhou State had been in Kunlun Mountain for hundreds of years. But now his master said that the dragon vein of Zhongzhou State had been lost? The dragon vein is lost? Ruzhen was stunned for a long time before he asked with a stutter. "Part of it is lost and part of it is scattered. There are still some remnants in Kunlun City." Great Master Wu Wei said softly, "Xian Xuanzi and I have been trying to reunite the dragon vein and restore the fate of the country over the years, but now, Xian Xuanzi has a choice and so have they. But his path is wrong. Who they were was obvious without asking. It was related to the fate of the country. It was impossible for the high-level officials of Zhongzhou State not to pay attention to this. At present, did they choose Xian Xuanzi? Why was this path wrong? But the dragon vein, how could it disappear? How is this possible?" Ruzhen rubbed his bald head with a confused look. 20 years ago, Li Kuangtu betrayed the country. After that war, the dragon vein was scattered. If Kunlun City really occupied the dragon vein, how could they be in this state now? Great Master Wu Wei snorted coldly. But Ruzhen still didn't understand. He asked cautiously, "Master, do you mean that Xian Xuanzi's path may not be able to reunite the dragon vein in the end?" "He can." Great Master Wu Wei sighed weakly. At this moment he seemed to have suddenly aged a lot, and his whole person was gloomy. If he can't, they won't choose him. Xian Xuanzi came here today to occupy the fate here, combine it with his fate and reunite the dragon vein in the shortest time. It's just that our directions are different. The dragon vein I condense is prosperous, but his choice is obviously more to the taste of some people. What's his choice? Ruzhen asked subconsciously. Great Master Wu Wei turned and walked into the temple, saying coldly, "Weapons." After entering the temple gate, he passed through the Super Master Hall and entered the Mahavira Hall. There was no chanting in the small Qingyun temple, which seemed empty and quiet. Great Master Wu Wei, who was a little unsteady, walked silently into the main hall. Without looking at Xian Xuanzi, who stood quietly in front of him, he knelt in front of the Buddha statue and chanted silently. Xian Xuanzi didn't look at him either. All his attention was focused on the two objects in front of him. In front of him were two discs about 20 centimeters in diameter, like a small wall clock, but there was only one pointer in the center of the disc. There were no numbers on the edge of the disc, only 4 traditional Chinese characters were engraved on it. The ups and downs of life and death. There were some patterns engraved in the center of the discs. One of the discs was engraved with something that looked like a metal tube and was painted silver. The other disc was engraved with a cloud of smoke. At this moment, the pointers in the two discs were constantly trembling. On the disc engraved with silver metal and copper, the slender pointer trembled and stopped in the center of the life gate, while on the disc engraved with cloud, the pointer stopped at the edge of the death gate. Destiny roulette? Xian Xuanzi stared at the two discs for a long time, then sneered and said, "Great Master, is it meaningful? You should know that it's the most useless thing. Many people who know the destiny roulette regard it as a treasure, but in fact, it's useless. The roulette can't control people's fate. On the contrary, it's completely controlled by people." "So what?" Great Master Wu Wei asked, kneeling on the rush cushion. Xian Xuanzi took a deep breath and stared at the disc engraved with the silver metal tube. After a long while, he said in a low voice, "When I saw Li Tianlan for the first time, I noticed that his fate was extremely strong, even rare for hundreds of years. But his fate was accumulated by the death qi, so he was destined not to live long. Great Master, you want to use the Li family to reassemble the dragon vein. This is really a wrong way." Great Master Wu Wei was silent. Xian Xuanzi said in a low voice, "How can Li Tianlan live? Even if you change his birth destiny or even let it return to chaos, how can he live? He will die sooner or later." Xian Xuanzi paused and said inexplicably, "The more glorious it was, the more chaotic it was." Great Master Wu Wei nodded to show his approval. He smiled and said, "So the general trend needs to be restarted, and the invincible realm is nothing." "Nothing?" Xian Xuanzi's tone was cold. "Li Tianlan? Can he do it?" "He can do it. Only he can do it. One day he alone will be enough to recreate the most glorious era." Great Master Wu Wei's tone grew calmer. "He will die." Xian Xuanzi shook his head. "If he is alone, he will die. But Qin Weibai is with him, and their fates are completely complementary. In terms of fate, they can be said to be a match made in heaven. With her, who dares to say that Li Tianlan will die?" Great Master Wu Wei still denied Xian Xuanzi's remarks. Xian Xuanzi snorted heavily, seemed to have gritted his teeth and said coldly, "The demon woman will bring chaos to the world." Buzz. As soon as his voice fell, the two discs in front of him suddenly made a soft sound. On the destiny roulette, the two pointers that had been trembling but never moved began to move in an instant. The pointer of the roulette engraved with a silver metal cylinder trembled slightly, and almost instantly turned from the gate of life to the center of the gate of death. The pointer stayed firmly in the middle of the gate of death, motionless. The pointer of the roulette engraved with clouds and smoke was also moving, from the edge of the gate of death to the gate of life. Xian Xuanzi froze for a moment, then chuckled and said, "Great Master, you're still wrong." He picked up one of the discs and said with a smile, "Li Tianlan's destiny points straight to the gate of death. There is no way he can survive. What else do you have to say? The death of the heavenly son is imperceptibly related to him. But things go in the opposite direction when they reach an extreme, which is not necessarily a bad thing." Great Master Wu Wei said calmly, "I still believe in those two children. Li Tianlan has fate and is the most suitable carrier. Little Bai can complement him. This is the most perfect yin and yang alternation. Fate, carrier. Yin and yang alternation." Xian Xuanzi's body shook violently, and his ruddy face seemed to turn pale for a moment. The horsetail whisk in his hand trembled violently. Staring at Great Master Wu Wei's calm profile, Xian Xuanzi said incredulously, "Do you want him to carry the dragon vein?" The dragon vein carried the fate of a country. If Li Tianlan carried the dragon vein, this was really against the will of heaven. "Are you crazy?" Great Master Wu Wei smiled without saying anything. Xian Xuanzi's face was cloudy. After a while, he said coldly, "Is this the reason why you chose them?" "Choice." Great Master Wu Wei shook his head. "If it's a choice, it's the destiny that chose me." He closed his eyes and his thoughts surged. More than a decade ago, in the winter of that year in the southwest of Zhongzhou State, When he first saw Qin Weibai, who was only 10 years old, it was in a heavy snow that was rarely seen in the southwest for many years. On that day in the snowy and turbid world, all he saw was a desolate soul covered with scars and a dead heart. A smile appeared on the corner of Great Master Wuwei's mouth. This was the destiny. A slight sound of breaking through the air suddenly sounded. Great Master Wuwei was motionless. In the dull sound, the soft horsetail whisk instantly became as straight as a sword. Xian Xuanzi held the horsetail whisk and stabbed it directly into Great Master Wuwei's heart. Blood spread. Great Master Wuwei opened his eyes, and his eyes were still calm. I got the fate of Qingyun Temple and regathered the dragon vein. Even if you have the destiny, what can you do? Xian Xuanzi said in an indifferent tone. Great Master Wuwei chuckled and put his palms together. He sighed and said, when things reach an extreme, they will move in the opposite direction. With his voice, Great Master Wuwei's long white hair, which reached his shoulders, instantly burned to ashes. A circle of invisible air waves spread around him. At this moment, Great Master Wuwei seemed to be glowing. He straightened his body. Boom. There seemed to be a roar between heaven and earth. The air waves expanded in an instant, carrying Xian Xuanzi's body and directly throwing him out of the hall. Great Master Wuwei, whose long hair was gone, had blood flowing from his chest and dyed his clothes red. Kneeling in front of the Buddha statue, he piously bowed his head and put his palms together. His voice was still loud and full of energy. Amit Ba. Pale-faced, Xian Xuanzi was thrown out of the hall. Holding the horsetail whisk tightly in his hand, his face was full of disbelief. A ray of dazzling light leaped out of the sky. The sky and the earth were covered with sunshine in an instant. When the morning light rose, night was approaching. Where there was morning, there was night. Chapter 206. It was cloudy at dawn. The morning sun was like fire. The blazing red sun leaped out of the eastern sea, and the darkness before sunrise began to fade. Endless light surged in the gathering clouds, and light and darkness intertwined. As the sun rose, all the clouds in the sky were illuminated into a gorgeous picture of light and darkness. The light pierced through the clouds and went through the sky. The gloomy darkness disappeared bit by bit, and the bright light fell from the sky, shining on the distant sea, the green trees and flowers in Changdao, and the tall buildings in the city. Everything seemed to happen in an instant, but it seemed to be a long time ago. It was another sunny day. Facing the sunshine of the third day, Li Tianlan slowly stepped on the grass under his feet, his mind calm and peaceful. The final battle was getting closer and closer. Since the end of the meeting on the first day, Li Tianlan seemed to have completely let go of everything. He didn't meditate or study the unique skills of martial arts. He quickly adjusted his state of mind and became empty and pure. In just one day he seemed to have adjusted himself to the best state. The morning wind floated in the air with the fragrance of grass and trees. Li Tianlan walked unhurriedly up a hillside covered with turf. This could be said to be one of the highest places in the whole club. Looking down from the top of the hill, most of the area in the club could be seen. The lake in the distance rippled gently, the flowers swayed, and the leisure area was full of people. This club, which had been closed for business, could be said to be the busiest time since its establishment. Cars drove in and out one after another. The whole club seemed to be operating something in an orderly and secret way. Li Tianlan looked at it quietly, with an inexplicable smile at the corner of his mouth. Today, Li Tianlan's realm had steadily stopped at the stabilization phase of the ice-condensing realm. Under the stimulation of the surge potion, the realm he showed was the stabilization phase of the fire-flaming realm. As for the actual combat strength, even Li Tianlan himself couldn't predict it if he didn't fight with all his strength. In the case that his realm and unique skills had temporarily reached the bottleneck, it was meaningless to meditate and study the unique skills. At least it couldn't play a better role in the upcoming final battle, but it would add more psychological burden to him. Li Tianlan didn't know when the final battle would break out, but he had decided to relax his mind and adjust himself to the strongest state before the final battle broke out. Although his realm was not high, his inheritance, physique, talent, and willpower combined together made him a combat capability that no one could ignore. At the critical moment of the final battle, anyone above the thunder-shocking realm had to exert the strength he should have. How are our preparations? Li Tianlan stood at the top of the mountain and looked down. He suddenly asked in a soft and calm tone. The last batch of weapons will be in place within 12 hours, through a special channel of the Samsara Palace. Behind him, Deep Dream answered seriously. When the supermasters of Samsara Palace had left the club, Sai City directly gave Li Tianlan the most direct protection. Most of the time, at least one of Deep Dream or Sunset Shadow would appear within 20 meters of Li Tianlan at any time, and the two of them appeared at the same time even more often. Deep Dream and Sunset Shadow. In recent years, they were the two most active assassins of Sai City in the outside world. Although they were not masters of the half-step invincible realm, for assassins in many cases, the level of their realm was not the most important factor. Now they were not at the top of the killer list, but with their close protection, Li Tianlan's safety could still be guaranteed. The Samsara Palace. Li Tianlan's body stiffened. After a while, he nodded and muttered to himself, "Well, the Samsara Palace?" His eyes were still calm, but his heart trembled quietly. The kind of uncatchable and uncontrollable powerlessness and melancholy swept through his nerves in an instant. It was faint but so deep. He and Qin Weibai, he lost contact again. The phone was not connected, no one answered the video call and no one responded to the message. Duke, Horsewoman, Flaming Fire, and several supermasters had completely disappeared. In a series of plans of Zhongzhou State, the whole Samsara Palace seemed to have faded out without a trace. Li Tianlan sighed softly, and his eyes were in a trance. In just a few days, Qin Weibai seemed to be deliberately erasing all traces of her invisibly. There was no disagreement or quarrel between the two. In the last video call, Qin Weibai was still as gentle as water. But in that almost obsessive attachment and gentleness, the two seemed to drift apart. Everything about the Samsara Palace began to leave him, and Sai City appeared beside him. Li Tianlan didn't know what Qin Weibai was thinking. But in that series of quiet actions, he felt not only cruelty but also determination. He shook his head, suppressed the chaos in his heart and calmed himself down again. The extremely closed living environment from childhood to adulthood seemed to have imprisoned his heart. Whether in the primeval forest or in the prison in the desert, Li Tianlan had his own goals and knew what he should do. When he walked out of the Li family's camp and came to Huading, facing the general trend in the great world, Li Tianlan had been at a loss, uneasy and even fearful and self-abased. Under such circumstances he met Qin Weibai, Yu Donglai, Li Baidian and Ning Chenqing. He had his own brothers, his own women and saw the turbulence of the world. Imperceptibly, Li Tianlan's uneasiness when he first entered the world seemed to have completely calmed down. His path was right in front of him. But now, as the Samsara Palace stripped him away and Qin Weibai deliberately cut off contact with him, Li Tianlan knew that the peace he thought was actually just an illusion. The sense of integration with the outside world was even mostly brought to him by Qin Weibai. When Qin Weibai disappeared, his sense of estrangement from the whole world suddenly began to reappear, so obvious and clear. He was no longer uneasy but he was at a loss. He had his own goals but he didn't know what to do for a while. So he stopped meditating and gave up improving his strength for the time being. He was adjusting his state, and he also wanted to seriously think about what he should do next when his heart was at its quietest. He had to do something. He had to. I should do something. With his back to Deep Dream behind him, Li Tianlan suddenly said calmly, "What do you want to do, young master?" Deep Dream was silent for a few seconds and said slowly, "I'm willing to do it for you." "No." Li Tianlan shook his head. "I'll do it, not you." He turned his head and looked at Deep Dream, whose enchanting face was full of doubts. He said with a smile, "It's different." Deep Dream blinked her bright eyes and didn't say anything. The current Li Tianlan was completely different from the Li Tianlan she first met. Could even be said that they were two different people. When she first met him, the young governor was calm, but behind that calmness, Deep Dream could clearly feel the seriousness and sharpness that came to her face. But now, he was still calm but with a real sense of relaxation. He stood there casually, gentle, and all the sharpness had disappeared. He was as quiet as an abyss, as ethereal as fog and as calm as ice. In this state, Li Tianlan's every move was with the most essential truth and gentleness. The truest was often the easiest to be ignored. All kinds of thoughts flashed through Deep Dream's mind. When she saw the smile gradually emerging in Li Tianlan's eyes, she was suddenly shocked. The eyes of the young governor opposite her, who could still be called a teenager, were as clear as water, but they seemed to have the power to see through the soul. They were soft and gentle, which made people panic. "I don't understand what you mean, young master." Deep Dream subconsciously avoided Li Tianlan's gaze and said, "How is my current identity in Zhongzhou State?" Li Tianlan said softly, as if he was asking Deep Dream or himself. He took out a cigarette and lit it. Looking at the black wooden box of cigarettes that belonged to the Wang family of Beihai, he was lost in thought. It's expensive beyond words. Deep Dream said without hesitation. Li Tianlan's current identity might be controversial, but under the shadow of being the son of a trader, he also had the halo of the young governor of Sai City. In Zhongzhou State, Sai City was a well-deserved superpower. Situ Tsangyue, the governor of Sai City, was known as the hidden god of Zhongzhou State. She controlled Setting Sun, one of the 12 murderous weapons. Even if she couldn't compare with the Wang family of Beihai and Kunlun City, she was a real behemoth. Li Tianlan was now the young governor of Sai City and one of the 3 young heavenly sons of Zhongzhou State. He was absolutely important. It was no exaggeration to say that he was expensive beyond words. Yes, but don't you think we're too deserted here? Li Tianlan's tone was bland. Deep Dream raised her eyebrows. Before she could speak, Li Tianlan continued, "My background is sensitive, but since I'm still in East Island, it means that the higher-ups have a relatively clear attitude toward it. I had a close relationship with Samsara before, and the situation was not clear, so it was reasonable for many people to wait and see. But now it's different. After the meeting the day before yesterday, we divided the defense areas, and I became the young governor of Sai City. But these days, how many people have come to visit Sai City?" Deep Dream was lost in thought. In the meeting the day before yesterday, military counselor of Samsara Palace and god of army of Zhongzhou State successfully connected. After careful planning, they temporarily divided Changdao into 3 closely connected defense areas in order to better deal with the next decisive battle. The 3 defense areas were actually 3 routes of retreat. To win, they had to consider defeat first. On this point, military counselor and god of army were surprisingly consistent, and their planning was also very steady. Even if they lost the final battle, as long as one defense area was held, it would be a way out for the elites of Zhongzhou State. If they gathered together, the probability of being wiped out would be too high. Now the 3 defense areas were closely connected, and the 3 groups of people could quickly support each other when they were in different places. In this way, it was impossible for East Island to concentrate its greatest strength in one place to destroy the elites of Zhongzhou State first. After all, this was not a decisive battle between the 2 sides, but a multi-sided melee. In addition to Zhongzhou State, there was also a team of a big dark force. Although East Island had the home field advantage and the advantage in personnel, all the superpowers were eyeing them covetously, so it was destined that East Island would not dare to risk its life to attack a force. This final battle was a defense for East Island, but for all the forces outside East Island, it was an attack. This advance and retreat between attack and defense at the right time was enough to create a huge advantage. Sai City was in charge of the number 3 defense area, centered on the clubhouse under their feet, which was the closest to the edge of the battlefield. At the same time, Mount Shu was also divided into the No. 3 theater of operations with Sai City. The Wang family of Beihai was in charge of the number 2 defense area, and several super masters of Samsara Palace would stay in the number 2 defense area under normal circumstances. But they did not belong to a specific area, and they provided full support. Kunlun City was in charge of the number 1 defense area, and the Eastern Theater of Operations was also planned inside the number 1 defense area. Of course, the forces participating in the Battle of Changdao were not these forces of Zhongzhou State. On the contrary, there were too many forces and agencies, so it was hard to discuss the most detailed plan in one meeting. The top management just divided the strongest or the largest number of forces into 3 defense areas. As for the other Secret Service agencies, they could freely choose their defense areas, and they would make adjustments after the final list of the 3 defense areas came out. Now one day after the meeting, there were forces that chose to join the number 3 defense area, but in contrast, there were too many people who chose to enter the number 2 defense area and the number 1 defense area. In Li Tianlan's view, this was not a normal phenomenon at all. In Zhongzhou State, Kunlun City and the Wang family of Beihai were indeed stronger than Sai City, but this was East Island. The final battle was coming, and it depended on the strength of the superpowers in East Island. In comparison, the strength of Sai City in East Island was no weaker than that of the other 2 defense areas. At least in terms of the top experts, Tribulation, known as the King of Shadow in the Dark World, was slightly stronger than Firmament in the number 2 defense area and Gu Zhendong in the number 1 defense area. In terms of strength and reputation, the only one who could compare with Tribulation was General of 9 Heavens, Gong Sun Chi, codenamed Azure Dragon. But Gong Sun Chi and his Terracotta Army were destined not to stay in one defense area. After all, they were the most aggressive special team. At least in Li Tianlan's view, if the forces invested by the superpowers in East Island were compared, even if Sai City was not stronger than the Wang family of Beihai, it was not weaker than the Wang family of Beihai, but it was stronger than Kunlun City. This was also something that made Li Tianlan confused. This time, Kunlun City strongly supported the national plan, and it could even be said to be the main promoter. Kunlun City set up the Snowdance Corps with Gu Qianchuan, an invincible realm expert, as the commander. He went to Northern Europe and invested a lot. But when it came to East Island, Kunlun City didn't invest much. Gu Zhendong, an invincible realm expert. Ice Crystal Frost Sword. Gu Yunxia. Plus Gu Hanshan. This seemed to be the main high-end force. The weirdest thing was that the higher-ups even acquiesced to this list with minimal investment. The reason for this was worth pondering. Li Tianlan didn't want to think too deeply. He only knew that when Kunlun City didn't invest as much in East Island as Sai City, there were many more people willing to join the number 1 defensive zone than the number 3 defensive zone, which was enough to explain the problem. This even showed that many people didn't approve of him, and they didn't approve of Sai City's willingness to accept him and even let him be the young governor. This might involve positions and grievances, but the most obvious thing was that they didn't think highly of Sai City. In the final analysis, it was just because he became the young governor of Sai City. Now, the halo over his head or his own strength seemed to be weaker than the other 2 young heavenly sons. So Li Tianlan had to do something. At least in this final battle, he had to make enough convincing results. For Li Tianlan, this was crucial for his development after returning to Zhongzhou State. If I go to fight with Wang Xingxiao now and I can beat him, I guess there will be a lot more people willing to join the number 3 defensive zone. Li Tianlan was silent for a while and then said with a smile. Deep Dream was a little surprised. Although Wang Xingxiao of the Wang family of Beihai was also called one of the 3 young heavenly sons of Zhongzhou State, in more people's hearts, he had become the leading figure of the young generation in Zhongzhou State. He was a thunder-shocking realm heavenly son with wind and thunder veins and top-notch inheritance. Even Deep Dream felt pressured by such a figure. After all, the young governor was a few years younger. Can you win? Deep Dream bit her red lip and asked softly. It's not a life-and-death battle. It's just a simple competition. No. Li Tianlan shook his head and was very frank. Why are you in such a hurry? The future of Zhongzhou State is destined to be your world. When you return to Zhongzhou State, there will be plenty of opportunities to compete. I don't think Xingxiao will refuse. A loud laugh suddenly rang out at the foot of the mountain, bold and unrestrained. Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows and looked down. In his sight, a strong man was walking to the hillside and looking at him with a smile. The man was handsome and about 40 years old. He was full of masculinity from head to toe, looking overbearing and strong. He was dressed in plain clothes, but he walked with a majestic gait, completely like an instinctive soldier. Li Tianlan frowned, and his eyes subconsciously fell on his chest and shoulders. There were no epaulets on the man's shoulders, but there was a vague mark on his chest like a dagger. It was very faint and vague with only a vague outline. General Wang? Morning. Li Tianlan knew what to do and greeted him with a smile. In the whole dark world, only one troop in Zhongzhou State would use such a vague mark. That was the Shadow Sting Troop, known as the largest special forces in Zhongzhou State. Although the Shadow Sting Troop was a special force, it had always been under the dual management of the army headquarters in Kunlun City. It was very important in the special warfare system of Zhongzhou State. Its leader was the deputy of the theater with the rank of lieutenant general, which could be said to be prestigious. Today, the leadership of the Shadow Sting Troop was in the hands of the Southeast Group, and it was a member of the Wang family of Beihai. The handsome man in the prime of his life was undoubtedly one of the core figures of the Wang family of Beihai, Lieutenant General Wang Zhaoyang, the leader of the Shadow Sting Troop. The internal structure of the Wang family of Beihai was extremely complicated. It was a supergiant that had always been in its heyday. Its internal structure was not as simple as 1 or 2 generations. In addition to the lineal descendants of Wang Tianzong, there were more than a dozen collateral branches, and each branch was extremely prosperous. There were hundreds of people in total. It was a real clan. Wang Zhaoyang was far from the lineal descendants of the Wang family of Beihai in terms of blood relationship, but he had a close personal relationship with Wang Xiaoyao. Wang Xingxiao was also very polite to him. No matter what the occasion was, he would call him sixth uncle. His status in the Wang family of Beihai was self-evident. Moreover, in the phone call with Principal Zhuang Huayang, Li Tianlan also heard Zhuang Huayang mention Wang Zhaoyang and the Shadow Sting Troop. It was said that Wang Zhaoyang had been instructed by Great Master Wu Wei and had a meteoric rise since he was young. He still had the potential to rise. This time, if Wang Xingxiao failed to compete for the position of the general of 9 regions in the Terracotta Army, it was very likely that the Wang family of Beihai would let Wang Xingxiao control the Shadow Sting Troop and push Wang Zhaoyang up after a few years. Li Tianlan would not be careless for such a figure who was not a lineal descendant of the Wang family of Beihai but was better than a lineal descendant. He shook hands with Wang Zhaoyang and took the initiative to ask again, "General, are you here for a walk?" "It's a good day for a walk but I don't have the time," Wang Zhaoyang said with a smile. "I'm here to see you." Li Tianlan remained calm and kept calm. He smiled gently and said, "General, what's the matter?" "The Shadow Sting Troop wants to form an alliance with young Master Li." "What do you think, young Master Li?" Wang Zhaoyang was a standard soldier. He was straightforward and liked to get straight to the point. However, his words carried a deep meaning. It was the Shadow Sting Troop that wanted to form an alliance with him, not the Wang family of Beihai. But in fact, the Shadow Sting Troop had always been considered a part of the Wang family of Beihai's investment in East Island. They were naturally included in the know. 2 defensive zone that the Wang family of Beihai was in charge of. What was the deep meaning of this alliance? The Wang family of Beihai and Sai City were separated by the Shadow Sting Troop. Was this alliance the goodwill of the Wang family of Beihai? However, the Wang family of Beihai stayed out of it. It could attack and defend at any time. How sincere could such goodwill be? Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes and said with a smile, "I'll seriously consider your suggestion. I don't know what the alliance you're talking about is." "Naturally, it's an ally who will give priority to support. Besides, we'll share some resources and intelligence." Wang Zhaoyang's voice was loud and clear. Li Tianlan's heart skipped a beat, but he remained silent. As the Wang family of Beihai that still occupied a large area of East Island, their infiltration in East Island was quite terrifying, and they were especially powerful in intelligence. Although Li Tianlan was the young governor of Sai City now, he could use the special channel of Samsara if he wanted to. Such sharing seemed to be harmless. However, the goodwill of the Wang family of Beihai was somewhat inexplicable. At this stage, was there really any intelligence that needed to be shared? Or maybe the information he needed wasn't about East Island? A cold light flashed in Li Tianlan's eyes. Did the Wang family of Beihai notice something? Or did they want to find out the background of the special channel of Samsara under the guise of sharing intelligence? In terms of intelligence, Sai City has a weak foundation in East Island. I'm afraid it can't help the Shadow Sting Troop. But in terms of resources and support, we're willing to ally with you, General. Li Tianlan said in a steady tone after a moment of silence. A strange light flashed in Wang Zhaoyang's eyes. He seemed to want to say something but he finally held it back. He said with a smile, "Okay. Young Master Li, if you like the weapons and resources of the Shadow Sting Troop, just say the word. We're willing to exchange. If Sai City needs it, we'll support it as soon as possible." Li Tianlan nodded and said, Several super masters of Samsara guarded the number 2 defensive zone in the middle, but they couldn't be regarded as people in the number 2 defensive zone. They were destined to wander all over the battlefield. And everyone, including Li Tianlan himself, believed that if he was in trouble, the super masters of Samsara would definitely come to support him at all costs. Li Tianlan didn't know if the Wang family of Beihai had noticed something strange, but at least they hoped to get the support of the super masters of Samsara in this alliance to some extent. Of course, in exchange, the support of the Shadow Sting Troop was also extremely important for Sai City. So, young Master Li, shall we have a good cooperation? Wang Zhaoyang smiled and reached out his hand. Besides, someone asked me to bring you a message. He lowered his voice slightly and continued, Kunlun City may not have invested much this time, but in fact, it has invested the most in East Island. Young Master Li, be careful. Li Tianlan's eyes suddenly became deep. He looked at Wang Zhaoyang and said slowly after a while, Who asked you to bring me the message? Wang Zhaoyang smiled and said nothing. Samsara? Li Tianlan's eyes became more and more focused. Wang Zhaoyang laughed and said that it was a good cooperation. Then he turned around and went down the mountain. Li Tianlan looked at his back in silence and didn't speak for a long time. Young master, the Wang family of Beihai can't be easily trusted. I received some secret news. It is said that the Wang family of Beihai in Kunlun City seem to be planning something, and a large part of the reason should be against you. Deep Dream stood behind Li Tianlan and said. Li Tianlan waved his hand, silently took out his mobile phone, and opened the communication software. Qin Weibai's account was still lying in the address book. It was still the same profile picture, quiet and unchanged. On the white paper there were 2 lines of light and beautiful small words. Who are you to me? Who are I to you? Li Tianlan was silent. His fingers moved and he slowly typed. Did you tell me the news about Kunlun City through Wang Zhaoyang? There was no response. Li Tianlan didn't give up and continued to type. Don't worry about anything. I know what to do. If I were strong enough, everything would not be like this today, right? I will become stronger. Become the strongest. There was still no response. At the top of Li Tianlan's message, there were 3 words sent by Qin Weibai, but he didn't respond. I miss you so much. Li Tianlan took a deep breath and suddenly smiled. He typed, the woman that several invincible giants in the dark world dream of, I slept with her as soon as I met her and I slept with her several times. Little Bai, do you think I'm the strongest? His mobile phone vibrated. Qin Weibai finally had a reply. 2 simple words, bad guy. Li Tianlan laughed, put away his mobile phone and looked into the distance. In the sunshine of the 3rd day, he could clearly feel that something was approaching. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.